Good morning, everyone. This morning is a Level 2 hearing. Under Level 2, the public gallery will be closed. Only a few accredited journalists will be allowed into the hearing room whilst evidence is being given at Level 2. Everyone else will be able to view the proceedings in the annex, subject to the 10-minute delay. No one, whether a member of a legal team, an accredited journalist, or members of the inquiry staff or contractors, will be permitted to bring an electronic device into the hearing room. This includes mobile phones, smartwatches, and earbuds, even if switched off. This is a direction of the chair, and breach of this direction is a criminal offence. The inquiry security team will be able to arrange safe storage of any such devices during Level 2 hearings, so please ask at the security desk. I would appreciate it if you would just take the next few seconds to check your pockets to make sure you have none of these devices in the room at the moment. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. O'Connor.
Sir, the first
item for today is a further tranche of evidence from Commander Murphy, who is, of course, still under oath.
Yes.
Commander Murphy, thank you for returning to the witness box.
Good morning.
The area that I want to ask you questions about this morning is Operation Wadana. And just to remind those who are following our proceedings, is this right? Operation Wadana was the overt police investigation into the poisoning of the Skripals.
Yes, that's correct. Something we called a reactive investigation, but investigated the crime after it happened.
Yes, and we've heard from you previously that, as it were, running alongside that investigation was another investigation called Operation Katerva.
Yes.
That was also an investigation which you were involved in. In fact, you headed.
Yes.
That was an investigation that was focused on responsibility for the attack. It was initially a covert investigation.
Yes, that's correct.
So that investigation will be the subject of your evidence next week when we hear about investigations into the suspects. Today, as I say, we will focus on Operation Wadana, and in particular, the early weeks of that operation, leading to and shortly after the identification of the front door of 47 Christa Miller Road as,
Yes.
to use a term I think you've used previously, the ground zero
Correct.
for the contamination.
Yes.
You understand? Much of what we have to explore this morning is addressed in your witness statement. And if we could have it up on screen, please. We've referred to this statement before. It's INQ 006056. And if we could just note paragraph 3 of that statement, please. It's on the bottom of page 1, going over to page 2. Commander Murphy, you refer there to the restriction orders that have been made in advance of these hearings by the chair.
Yes.
Which, of course, your team, the police team, Operation Verbasco, have been very much involved with. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we look towards the bottom of that page, the point you're making, is this right, is that this statement is, as it were, designed to say everything that can be said in open about Operation Wadana and so on.
That's correct.
But you also note, and this is the sentence starting at the very end of the last line of page 1, you say, this means that not all matters which I consider important to address are addressed in this statement. The inquiry will, however, be able carefully to explore these aspects enclosed.
That's correct, yes.
So is it right, just so there's no mystery about this, there is another version of this statement which contains more detail, the extra detail being closed material.
Yes, absolutely. A much longer version, yes.
And those are matters which we will be able to explore in closed session. You will return on that occasion and be able to give further evidence to the chair, which, because of the restriction orders he's made, you are not able to give this morning.
Correct, yes.
And it may be, Mr. Murphy, that as we go through the questions this morning, comes a time where you have to indicate that you can say no more about a particular subject, or possibly nothing about
Yes.
a particular subject. And in that event, we will put those matters to one side and pick them up again in the closed hearing.
Great, thank you.
So let's start chronologically, if we may, with the outset of Operation Wadana. And in order to do that, we can go to page 11 of your statement, paragraph 48. And you indicate that Operation Wadana was established on the 5th of March, so that's the Monday after the poisoning on the Sunday,
Yes.
as the CTPSE, Counter-Terrorism Police Southeast, which we've heard about,
Yes.
reactive investigation into the poisoning of the Skripals.
Correct.
We heard in particular last week, but then also again yesterday, about the events in and around Wiltshire Police on the day before that, on the Sunday.
Yes.
In particular in the evidence with Deputy Chief Constable Mills. We heard about the developing understanding of the position on the Sunday evening between Inspector Hughes and Superintendent Corner. Did you follow that evidence?
Yes, I did, yes.
The Googling of Sergei Skripal,
Yes.
Superintendent Corner's concern, even at that stage, that what had happened might have been an assassination attempt,
Yep.
the order to send armed police to the hospital,
Yes.
the briefing of Mr. Mills, and then the exchanges that were had between, I think, Inspector Hughes and Superintendent Corner that night with what they described as special branch.
Yes.
And I think we established that that was their sort of colloquial term for what was in fact the Southwest Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Unit.
Yes, I think Wiltshire actually still had special branch officers at that time, but as an on-call arrangement in an evening or over a weekend, it would be quite normal that that was covered by the Southwest CTIU, and in this case, I believe a Gloucestershire officer was on call overnight.
Yes, and that was certainly what Inspector Hughes' statement referred to.
Yes.
And the SWC TIU, is it right that was part of the counter-terrorism police structure in the UK?
Yes, absolutely. So that was covering the Southwest region, and it was part of CT policing.
Yeah.
In today's language.
I'd just like, before we go on and get into Operation Madonna, I'd just like to ask you about two issues relating to the evidence we heard about that night.
Yes.
The first is that, certainly on Inspector Hughes's account, the on-call CTP officer that she spoke to, as you rightly recall, the Gloucester officer, had what she described as a dismissive attitude towards the queries she was raising with him. We saw an email where she recorded her impression as being that she wasn't being taken seriously that night. Now, it's obviously important to add that we haven't heard or seen an account from the CTP officer himself. Yes. But if Inspector Hughes is right about the way in which her queries were responded to, would you agree that that is an inappropriate and unprofessional way to react to a query?
Yes, it's extremely disappointing, actually. So we ask a lot of CTP officers performing on-call duty all around the country. And, of course, when a force, particularly when we're encouraging forces to get in touch with us and also the public, we clearly expect the on-call CTP officer to provide an entirely professional response in terms of how they approach that contact. I've had the opportunity to look at and see the evidence provided in the last few days, and I don't think that officer necessarily performed to the standard of that we would have expected from all of our officers.
So we've heard about the developing structure and the fact
Yes.
that the special branch function was taken away from individual forces and moved onto a regional basis, which then no doubt gives rise to the on-call arrangements. But as you say, if there's going to be an on-call arrangement, then it's almost a pretty basic point that the people at the end of the phone need to be ready and receptive to the calls that are made.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when it's not one of your own force officers that you're speaking to. So in order to have a regional arrangement, we need to have confidence in all of the forces in that region that the response they will receive from CT policing is a professional one. Now, I think all of the right information was provided on that night, but as I say, I don't think the contact itself was professional.
Thank you. That was the first point. The second point I want to come to is more substantive. And we've heard evidence in the course of those exchanges that there was a discussion about the possibility that, in effect, CTP might take over the investigation that night. In fact, the discussion was about a CTP, Senior Investigating Officer, being appointed, which comes to the same thing, does it not?
Yes.
Can we look, I'd like you to look at Superintendent Corner's witness statement, please. So it's INQ 006163. If we go to page 8 within that statement. And it's paragraph 36, so at the bottom, it goes over the page. You'll see it on the screen. What he said about this was that at approximately 2200 hours, that's on the Sunday night,
Yes.
I believe I had a further call from my special branch contact. In fact, I think he was communicating not with the Gloucester officer, but the head of the Southwest Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Unit.
Okay.
Advising that checks had revealed nothing further to assist us with our inquiries. I remember thinking that it was an odd response, which suggested that they could neither confirm nor deny any information that they may have held on the Scripples. And then this, I was also informed that they were not going to assign an SIO from their side. I was advised to run the incident as per a normal investigation with a force inspector. To me at that time, it was inappropriate for the incident to be investigated at this level, especially if it turned out to be an attempted assassination, which I thought was a possibility. Now, of course, we know that the very next day, CTP did appoint an SIO and take over the investigation. Superintendent Corner's view was that, in fact, that should have happened that night, and the word he used was inappropriate for the investigation to be left with Wiltshire.
Yes.
What's your view about that?
I don't suppose you'll be surprised to know that I don't agree with him in that respect, and there's several reasons why, actually. It is quite normal for investigations and incidents to happen around the country on an almost weekly and sometimes daily basis, where it's too early to tell whether or not there's a national security or counter-terrorism footprint here. And in the first part of paragraph 36, it references the neither confirm nor deny assessment. Well, we now know that, of course, the Gloucestershire officer did provide everything that we had. It wasn't that, and I saw Mr. Mann's evidence yesterday as well. It wasn't that there was further information that we were not providing. It was simply that there was no further information to provide. And so it's quite normal for us to have initial notification from a force that an incident is happening. And then if we don't hold any information that suggests a national security or counter-terrorism footprint in that investigation, for us to act as in a sort of monitoring capacity to understand whether or not any further information develops as part of those inquiries that would mean that we should step in and either provide more support or on some occasions lead, as you've said, has subsequently happened. So it would not be appropriate to have assigned a senior investigating officer from counter-terrorism policing on the basis of what was known at this time. CTP, in essence, knew exactly what Wiltshire knew, which was there was some open source reporting on who Sturgess may have been, and of course a contact that related to a conversation with Sturgess' son at a border in 2011. So yes, I don't agree. In any normal circumstance, we would not have supplied an SIO or taken any lead of an investigation until more information came to light. So I think the advice from the region at that time to Wiltshire, which was continue to conduct your investigation and assess and keep in touch with us, was the right advice.
Just to test you on that slightly, yeah. You obviously have great experience of these matters. To those of us who don't, it might be slightly eyebrow-raising to see a case where the local police are seriously considering the possibility of an international assassination attempt having taken place. They're ordering armed police to go to the hospital, and yet your national policing body is still saying, no, it's not for us, it's for you.
Well, it's not that we weren't saying it's not for us. We were saying we'll continue to monitor this, but actually, right now, we're not going to step in and lead this investigation. This is a matter for you to assess and keep in touch with us. And that happened overnight, actually. So we continued. That's why the CBRN Centre were already engaged, and of course, that advice is critical. They're part of, it's important to say, the CBRN Centre is a part of counter-terrorism policing. So the network were engaged in specialist support to the CBRN side. But in an investigative sense, we wouldn't do this. Look, on a very regular basis, and in London particularly, we will receive a phone call from a frontline officer who says they're responding to an incident where an individual is in hospital and they believe they've been poisoned by a foreign state because they are at risk from that foreign state in some way. And the officer is concerned that there may be some kind of assassination underway. These things, and I appreciate we're here talking about an incident that did happen, but they are nonetheless still extraordinarily rare. And it's very, very important, as we've seen in a number of individuals giving evidence here at the inquiry, to conduct as much information as possible for that assessment to be an informed one. Lots of people were still treating this as a potential drugs overdose at this point. And it's absolutely right that the police officer in this case, quite a few police officers have made their assessment, but they're conducting inquiries to support that assessment and, of course, remain open-minded to other hypotheses as well, as you've heard from many of them. So it happens quite regularly, unfortunately, and then as a result, we need to ensure that whilst we keep in touch, we make that assessment on the basis of an evidence base or a strong intelligence case.
Let me ask you a slightly different question, although sticking in this general area, which is, you've obviously seen all the evidence about what in fact happened that night.
Yes.
Do you think that the investigation suffered as a result of counter-terrorism police not taking over at that point?
Actually, I have to say I thought Wiltshire did a very good job of that initial stage of the investigation, both in terms of its initial response and in terms of the specialist response that followed. So I think the search of the house for the reasons articulated by Mr. Mant yesterday were absolutely the right things to do. They took specialist advice in doing so. And when more and more information became available and when that assessment became clearer on Monday morning, as we've touched upon, but I'm sure we'll discuss, as I mentioned, as part of us staying in contact, when that information becomes available, then obviously we review that decision on a regular basis.
Okay. And moving forward a little bit then, we saw the fact that a decision in fact was taken the next morning that
Yes.
CTP would take over. In brief, what had changed at that point?
Well, I think so. Overnight, obviously there was more information and activity happening. You've heard of the search of the premises. A handover was done that was read by the Senior National Coordinator, DAC Hayden, and read that handover, spoke to the Chief Constable. And even at that point, actually, it wasn't that we were going to lead the investigation at that point, but it was agreed that we would step in and support Wiltshire's investigation. And that's quite normal, actually. There are probably 3 stages, and that's one is a watching brief, if I can call it that, where we are aware of something happening but not involved and just keep in touch with what's happening. The second one is that we might deploy resources, but in a fully support capacity, so we're not taking any leadership or ownership of the challenge, but are providing resources. That's the decision that was taken initially on Monday morning. But as the picture developed on Monday, it then became much clearer that actually this was a national security incident, and as a result then, during Monday, DAC Hayden, as the Senior National Coordinator, agreed that we would take the lead for it, and a superintendent from the South East was assigned to lead the investigation.
Yeah, thank you. And then just the last point on this, it's sort of been implicit in everything you've said so far, but as you have just indicated, what became clear was that this was a national security incident. There was never any suggestion it had anything to do with terrorism, and yet you are the counter-terrorism police. Help us with that.
Yes, thank you. It's, so there are actually 2 things that we do as counter-terrorism policing and a third thing that we refer to as a duty. So counter-terrorism is the mainstay of our activity, but we also lead on counter-state threats and national security incidents for the country as well, from a policing perspective, clearly working with our intelligence agency partners. In addition to that, there's a duty that we have that relates to war crimes, not relevant to this inquiry.
But that's then the backstory, the appointment of a CTP SIO on that Monday, and you describe in your statement that that individual was Detective Superintendent VN012.
Yes.
And you, when you were giving evidence on a previous occasion, you described that you were involved from that day. I think the term you used was as a critical friend to that officer. Can you just remind us? I'm going to now be asking you a series of questions about how the investigation developed.
Yes.
In the week or 2 to follow. So just give us a summary of your role as a critical friend in that first two weeks or so of the investigation.
So on Monday afternoon, when the superintendent from the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit was assigned to the investigation, I was the duty senior officer for the Counter-Terrorism Command in London. I was also happened to be an officer who was leading our counter-state threat response for SO15 as well, and so I was asked to act as a critical friend to the superintendent from the South East. That role largely involved me working alongside that officer, offering support, guidance and advice where I could, and in essence ensuring that the processes were in place to ensure that any engagement with intelligence agencies was as efficient as it could be.
I'm just looking in your statement. Can't remember whether it contains this information or not, but did you go to Salisbury on that Monday?
No, so I didn't go to Salisbury for quite some time, but I did go to the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit. Forgive me, I believe I went down, my first deployment was actually on the Tuesday afternoon after the initial results had been received to confirm that it was a nerve agent.
Now, as I say, in a moment I'm going to take you quite carefully through the developing understanding of the position in the first week or two of the investigation. But just before I do that, I imagine you would agree with me that this is a topic where we should be particularly careful about the dangers of hindsight. Things look very ordered and very clear to us now. We've seen the documents, we've read the police report. But I imagine, and tell us if this is right, that in those very early days, the position was anything but clear.
Yes, absolutely. So lots of our considerations, and in fact I imagine lots of Wiltshire's considerations, and some of the things you heard over the last few days would confirm this to be the case, is that we of course have to operate with the information that's known to us at the time. And so some of our decisions and information now we have a much fuller picture of what happened. It's really important to remember that at the time we were working with what was known to us at the time, and a lot of our decision logs should reflect that information position taken at the time.
I mean, you certainly knew from the very early days that there was a lethal nerve agent that had been released in Salisbury.
Yes, from the Tuesday morning, yes.
You knew it was lethal, capable of seriously injuring and killing people precisely because of the scribbles in hospital and then the police officers attending hospital thereafter.
Yes, absolutely.
But you didn't know how many sites had been contaminated, which sites were contaminated, how seriously they had been contaminated. And we'll come back to this, but of course you couldn't ask the Scripples because for many weeks they were unconscious.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, probably a very good example, a sort of tangible example of that is on the Monday. So I think Wiltshire Police have done a great job at deciding where a scene might be, including the two victims, by the way, and had secured those scenes. But by Monday afternoon, when more information became available from our investigators supporting Wiltshire, we added two more scenes, Zizi's and the Mill Public House that afternoon. So as a demonstration, as more information became available, clearly we were then having to respond to that information.
And something you mentioned in your statement is that the Mill and Zizi's were not only identified as scenes, but a decision was taken to close them.
Yes.
And does that raise another dimension of the difficulty, which is that you were simultaneously having to investigate what appeared potentially to have been a very serious criminality,
Yes.
alongside considering public safety in a busy market town?
Yes, in an incident like this particularly, but in any crime investigation, but certainly in counter-terrorism and national security incidents, public health and safety and the well-being of the public and our own staff is of the utmost importance in everything that we do. You know, we don't want to create any additional risk to the public in any way. So balancing those decisions with investigative decisions is always a challenge, and that's why it's one of our main, repeated throughout, actually, you'll notice, and I would suggest for most SIOs, the prevention of further harm to the public is a very significant and usually one of the very earliest priorities of any investigation.
Yet another dimension, which in fact we haven't heard much about in the evidence, is the enormous media attention.
Yes.
Within a day or so of the poisoning. We saw statements in Parliament. We've heard about Salisbury being clogged up with media vans and so on.
Yes.
Did that have an impact on your thinking and your actions in those weeks?
Yes. I was involved in Litvinenko, actually, and I have to say, I think, even with that in mind, this was truly an unprecedented incident of a scale that we had not seen, both in terms of the media interest, in terms of even in those early hypotheses of trying to understand the risk might be that this had been a state-sponsored, it was one of our many hypotheses, by the way, but that this had been a state-sponsored incident. Clearly, that then brings additional complexities into how we communicate with each other and the the day-to-day management of our investigation. So unprecedented on lots of levels, but yes, the media were real and present in every aspect of Salisbury and almost every aspect of police activity.
I mean, one aspect of this is that you were trying to undertake an investigation using, as it were, normal police methods,
Yes.
despite the abnormal circumstances, to find out what had happened.
Yes.
At a time when there was a dialogue going on at a national and international level, with assertions being made about who was responsible, counter-assertions, and so on. Did that impact your investigation?
It didn't impact it, no, because actually, I mean, it's important that you're aware of that as a senior investigating officer, and the superintendent from the South East and I were very alive to those conversations and the diplomatic and political conversations that were happening internationally. But the reality is our role is to follow the evidence that was in front of us and try and understand what had happened. And for two reasons, really, as we'll get to, I'm sure, but to work out if there's any additional Novichok there and to identify who might be responsible as part of protecting the public and conducting an investigation.
So with all those things in mind, let us turn to the first day, which is, as we've said, the 5th of March, the Monday. And if we could look, please, at page 12 of your statement. This is something you've touched on already, but paragraph 53, you indicate there that the superintendent, the SIO of Operation Wadana, at this very early stage, had managed to get hold of local CCTV,
Yes.
and therefore had established that the Scripples had been both to the mill and Zizi's, and indeed Sainsbury's car park.
Yes, absolutely.
So that was day one knowledge.
Yes, Monday afternoon.
And if we could go forward, please, to page 14. Paragraph 64 of page 14, you refer to a general point, which is that these working hypotheses should be broad enough to prevent tunnel vision, even if there is an immediate preferred view.
Yes, absolutely. Keep an open mind.
And then you come on to what the sort of working hypotheses, and can we take it that these were the SIO's working hypotheses on that Monday?
Yes.
And you can see they're listed there, 4 broad possibilities: accidental poisoning, deliberate self-harm, general criminal activity, and criminal activity related to the Russian state. I mean, those hypotheses are notable for being really very broad at that stage.
I think it's really important at an early stage of an investigation to keep exactly that as well. As you've heard, actually, during the initial response to the incident, there were lots of potential, even medical hypotheses for what might have happened to Sergei and Yulia. So, whilst we now knew, certainly by not on the 5th of March, but on the early hours of the 6th of March, about what it was, the reality is we, of course, were in a position where, in that early stage, we need to keep a very open mind.
I mean, as you say in paragraph 64, there might have been a preferred view, but you need to keep the working hypotheses broad. Was there a preferred view on that day, or?
I mean, not on that day, but obviously, given who Sergei was and given how serious this incident was, don't forget, at this point we were still conducting our initial investigation, and we were as yet unclear on exactly what had caused their illness. It was nonetheless really important for us to, whilst keeping an open mind, recognise this could be a very serious crime committed in the UK, and of course that maintained our focus.
Yeah. In any event, if we look down towards the bottom of this page, we can see that things moved on really within hours of those initial hypotheses, did they not?
They did.
Because if we look down to the bottom of the page in paragraph 67, we can see that in the early hours of Tuesday, there were 2 notifications. First, at 4:15 in the morning, an indication that DSTL had confirmed that the Scripples had been poisoned by some form of organophosphate substance.
Yes.
We've heard quite a lot about the science by now. I won't
Yes.
ask you any more questions about that.
I'm grateful, thank you.
But then, only a few hours later, at 8:40, if we scroll down, a second call providing more detail, that it wasn't that then just any old organophosphate, but that it was a nerve agent
Yes.
that had caused the illness.
Absolutely.
So what effect did that information have on those working hypotheses we've just been looking at?
Oh, I mean, they absolutely stay as they are. They are still, they remain for working hypotheses, but actually, of course, it causes you to then reflect on those hypotheses, and you can choose a favoured one, but clearly you need to still maintain an open mind, because the fact that it's a nerve agent, we still needed to understand where it come from and the circumstances of how they came to be poisoned. So, but actually, yes, of course, it really focuses the mind quite substantially at that point.
Yes, and I mean, let's not be fine, keep the hypotheses broad, but it surely must have been the case that extra information gave considerable extra weight to the last hypothesis,
Absolutely.
the criminal activity on the part of the Russian state.
Yes, although not at the Russian state at that moment, but on a state, yes. But of course, the fact that it was a nerve agent then focused the mind on that final hypothesis.
And it must also have brought into focus the tension that you've already mentioned between, on the one hand, the role of the police in protecting the public.
Yes.
And the need to protect the public must have been all the more obvious once you realised that there was actually a nerve agent in play.
Yeah, I'll describe it as a very sobering moment to realise that actually there was a chemical warfare agent present in Salisbury, responsible for Sergei Nulia's poisoning. We had a number of scenes now that we were clearly deeply concerned were contaminated with that. And yes, there's significant implications then from anybody who might have been to those locations, and you know, of course, where might there be contamination that we're unaware of? So yes, it's a extremely sobering moment in a very unusual investigation.
But I mentioned attention because, as you've just explained, public safety, the importance of that became obvious. But equally, this must also have made it a much stronger hypothesis that there was some criminal activity involved.
Of course.
And we've already heard from officers about the well-known importance of the so-called golden hour,
Yes.
the value of early investigation. That must have been that much more difficult with the public safety considerations.
Yes, I think it was, absolutely. I mean, I think the early decisions taken by Wiltshire to secure the scenes had helped with some of that public safety issue, and of course we were then able to take decisions during Monday, for example, on the mill and Zizi's. But yes, I mean, absolutely, throughout what followed, almost everything we did was done with a view to, yes, gathering as much evidence as possible to point towards a firm hypothesis and gather as much evidence as we could, but do that in the context of trying to keep the public safe.
And is it, in practice, will the SIO balance those two considerations and give one or take from the other and come up with a sort of mixed view? Or on the other hand, and I appreciate things are never quite as simple as this, is there simply a priority that's given to one or the other, which must always...
No, it's very difficult to give priority to one or the other, but I would say absolutely, if there was to be one of those priorities, and there were some decisions where this was absolutely taken, then public safety is the one that overrides the other. We need to understand the risk to our evidence case but we cannot add risk to the public. Yeah. So ultimately, the overriding point of any, or consideration in any of our decisions, is that we cannot increase the risk to the public, and we must try in every case to try and reduce that risk.
And last point on this, public safety, yes, but there are similar considerations, are there not, relating to the safety of your police officers?
Yes, absolutely. As you'll no doubt hear, we were putting police officers in scenes that were contaminated with one of the most dangerous substances on the planet. And that was a very substantial decision to be taken in a leadership sense, but also those officers were all volunteers going into that work. And I reflect on the same you heard from Mr. Mant yesterday in respect of the decisions to enter the premises. Now, of course, at the time, the Wiltshire officers didn't know what they were dealing with and going into. Of course, we now knew that we were dealing with a nerve agent, and that comes with an additional level of of protective security required to keep all of our own staff safe.
Now, we've spoken a little bit about the twin imperatives, the criminal investigation, the public safety issues. That they can't obviously completely be divorced from each other, but you'll appreciate that you are due to come back on another, you might even think yet another occasion, to give evidence which is focused on the public safety aspect of the investigation. So I won't be dwelling on those points today. But if we could go on to page 16 of your statement, please, and look at paragraph 73. At that paragraph, you state that from the outset it was important to identify the specific point of initial contamination. This would help us to protect the public and secure evidence. So are you conveying there that this, going back to those dual thoughts, this was serving both a public safety imperative and also helping the criminal investigation?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, at this point, we did not know where they had come into contact with Novichok. And so the point here is, until we find that point, we're not going to be able to take the informed decisions that help keep the public as safe as possible in the way that we would like to.
We see there, it's a term we've already used, you got into the habit, you and your colleagues.
Yes, subsequently regretted that habit, but yes, we did get into the habit of calling it Ground Zero.
Why did you regret it?
Only because the connotations of links to 9/11, and we spoke a lot to colleagues. So Ground Zero just became an unfortunate term, but it was one that stuck, I'm afraid.
In any event, as you say, it's stuck. It's in the document, so
yes,
there's not much we can do about it
no.
now. Let's move on in the story, please, to the next day. So that takes us to Wednesday, the 7th of March. And if we go to page 17 of your statement, at paragraph 80, you mention, as we heard, that it was on that day that D.S. Bailey, in fact, was admitted to hospital. He'd been the previous day, but this was the day that he was admitted.
Yes.
And there was a concern that the public health advice from Public Health England wasn't sufficient. DAC Hayden became involved. And you refer to a man called Nick Gent, whose name came up in yesterday's evidence.
Yes.
Who was he?
So Nick worked for Public Health England, and he was one of the health professionals from Public Health England that was advising us.
And we can see that you've set out there that his working hypothesis on this day, that's the Wednesday, first of all was that the nerve agent would have been taken orally. And he also stated that presumably building on that hypothesis,
yes,
had they taken it orally, it would have likely taken around 2 minutes to have an impact on their health if it was ingested. You've mentioned the Litvinenko case where, of course, there was an ingestion of poison. Do you think that, perhaps understandably, was people's sort of immediate starting point, or was there more to it than that?
Well, I think it was, but I couldn't say whether Nick Gent had anything more in his mind about that. But they had eaten, having heard that information clearly, they had just come from Zizi's restaurant where they'd eaten food. So, of course, that was a significant factor for us anyway. But so I can't say whether or not the Litvinenko experience confirmed that. But this was really important to us. And I suppose the principle here is, of course, when you're trying to start an investigation like this, you need to work backwards from where the victims were found. And on the basis of science and health advice, it helps you to prioritise what you do working backwards.
Yes.
And so Zizi's became a particular focus at this point because it would have taken, in that 2-minute period, around a minute of that would have been walking to the bench, and the rest of the time would have been in Zizi's.
Yep. So, as you say, on that hypothesis, it's very clear where the trail leads to. It leads back to Zizi's. And you've also explained that by that point it was known that they had been to the mill before going to Zizi's.
Yes.
From the CCTV coverage.
Yes.
And I think it's right to say then that on that Wednesday the 7th, both Zizi's and the mill were entered and samples were taken in those two places.
Yes, I think that is. I'm not entirely. I don't recall that we entered the mill actually on that day. I thought we had worked backwards in stages, but it might be that it was entered on that day as well.
Let me take you to a document. I mean, the precise detail may not matter, but
Okay.
if we could go, please, to INQ 006050, we will see, Commander Murphy, a number of documents containing test results.
Yes.
The one I'm showing you now is, I think it's fair to say, the sort of, to the extent there is an authoritative document, it's this one.
Yes.
And this records the whole vast span of the testing on both Operation Wadana and Operation Reed.
Yes.
And if we look, so I think we've gone probably to page 8 to start with. Can you see there in the first few lines? Well, first of all, if we look at the very top of the page, we can see sample tracking ZZs. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then the first few lines of the table itself, the date of receipt is the 7th of March.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, you can help us perhaps. That doesn't perhaps necessarily tell us whether the sampling was done on the 7th or possibly even the day before, but it must follow that it was done at least on that day.
It would probably have been quite unusual for us to keep any samples we'd taken for any length of time, to be honest, and they would have gone straight to Porton Down.
I was going to say, this isn't the moment to have a detailed explanation as to how the process worked.
Yes.
But the receipt means receipt at Porton Down, doesn't it?
Yes.
So it's a reasonable inference that the testing at ZZ's was done on the 7th, yes?
Yes.
And then if we go over the 2 pages to page 10, similar document at the very top. This is the mill.
Yes.
And the first few lines, again, you can see that it's the 7th again.
Yeah, very clear.
So both of those places apparently sampled on that Wednesday.
Yes.
And we'll come to look at the results and the impact of the results of those tests in a moment. But just to finish off the result, the detail of that day on the Wednesday, is it right that late at night on the Wednesday was the first CTP search of 47 Christa Miller Road? Of course, we've heard about the Wiltshire Police search on the Sunday night, but it was on that Wednesday night that your officers went back into the house.
Yes, I believe that was our first entry, yes.
And we can just see a document relating to that search. If we can go to INQ 005668, please, at page 2. Commander Murphy, this is an email, and in fact there are a whole series of emails similar to this. They appear to be some sort of informal report back on duties undertaken. Is that fair?
Yeah, so in essence, for every bit of forensic activity that was taking place, this was the emails that were going back into the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit in order to keep track of what was happening.
And we see from the very top of the page, it's sent in the very early hours of the Thursday morning, the 8th.
Yes.
But it describes, looking down, what's described as an initial search of 47 Christa Miller Road that took place in the final hour or so of the 7th of March and then the first hour of the Thursday morning.
Yes.
In the middle of the night. Now, we will look at one or two other of these emails in due course, and the later emails often refer to sampling exercises that were undertaken. This is notable, is this right, by the fact that there wasn't any sampling undertaken that night. It seems just to have been an evidential, a search for, well, you tell us, but useful pieces of evidence.
Yeah, so it's initial assessment, really. So this is about mapping out the house, taking photographs, seeing photographs, so we understand the layout of the premises, and it can help us inform any work that we do in the future. But it is also then to what we call fast-track exhibits, so to try and identify some, usually digital exhibits, in this case they were, that we might be able to recover from the premises and examine as a priority.
So you say digital, we can see here mobile phones, laptops,
Yes.
USB sticks and so on.
Yes.
And would that be for the purpose of interrogating their contents
Yes.
as opposed to testing them for contamination?
Well, actually for both, but yes, in order, obviously, how we would normally examine digital devices in a non-CBRN incident is very different to what we do in a CBRN incident. So, of course, yes, we need to take these devices to a facility that allows us to examine them in that, with that risk in mind.
But the purpose of
Examining
retrieving those
content.
exhibits on that night was so that you could examine them.
Content, yes.
Thank you. Now, just before we leave this document, Commander Murphy, if we just cast our eye towards the bottom of the page, we can see a reference to Sergei Skripal's pets, the cat
Yes.
loose in the house and the guinea pigs in the cage.
Yes.
Now, you may recall that in the Russian embassy document that we've looked at, I'm not going to call it up,
Yeah.
but there is a reference to Mr. Skripal's pets and some uncertainty about what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what happened to them, please?
Yes, absolutely. So over time, every time we were in the premises, we were trying to care for the animals, but the cat was particularly stressed by our presence. Subsequently, we knew the house was contaminated, so for well-being reasons associated to the cat and its condition and the fact that it was likely to have been contaminated, the cat had to be euthanized for its welfare, and the guinea pigs subsequently died of natural causes in the house.
And as you say, given the contamination
Yes.
that was it not on this night, but very shortly thereafter discovered in the house, was there in truth any prospect of removing the animals from the house?
I do not believe there was any prospect of them ever coming out of the house, no.
Thank you. Let's move on then, we can put that document away, to the next day, to the Thursday, the 8th of March. And if we can go back to your statement, please, and go to page 18, paragraph 82. You refer here to the results of those tests that we were just looking at the mill and ZZ's. In fact, I think perhaps you only referred to the mill, but the point you make here is that contamination was found not only at ZZ's, but also at the mill.
Yes, it just demonstrates, I think, the importance of following the evidence chain that it comes in. So what happened here is, as you say, on the 7th, we'd been into both premises and conducted some initial sampling. But the first samples that came back demonstrated that there was contamination in the mill where Sergei and Yulia had been. And that meant that that might question the 2-minute hypothesis, because clearly it was a lot longer than 2 minutes that they were in the mill. So, yes, it demonstrates, I suppose, the necessity of keeping an open mind.
Let's just have a look at the test results, please. We'll start with ZZ's. Let's start with the mill. If we could go to the graphics pack, please, and go, so it's INQ 005819. If we could go to page 86. This is just to remind ourselves of the evidence about where Sergei and Yulia Skripal were sitting in the mill.
Yes.
We looked at this page when you gave evidence previously, and you can see the two photographs. Yes, thank you. That photograph shows them, and we looked at this before. It's slightly deceptive, but it does show them sitting in the middle of a run of 3-step tables, doesn't it?
Yes, that's correct. I believe it was table 27 from memory, but yes.
We'll see it's written on the page, exactly 27, but just it's the table, as it were, behind Sergei Skripal is slightly hidden by the banisters, but that's
Yes.
the third one, isn't it?
Yes.
And then we can see the plan below the photographs, as you say, table 27 in the middle of those 3 seats. This, we are looking, are we not, at stills from the CCTV within the mill.
Yes, we are.
And if we just, for completeness, go over the page, please, to the next page of the graphics pack, we see a similar plan of ZZ's. No photographs of the inside. Why was that?
I don't actually know why you were not seeing photos of
I think, is it right, there wasn't any CCTV?
sorry, yes,
ZZ's.
correct. Yes.
So it wasn't possible to tell from CCTV where they
Yes,
were
absolutely. Yeah.
sitting? But was it from witness evidence that you had obtained details of where they were sitting?
Yes, it was quite a large restaurant, lots of tables, so it was really important to try and understand where they were for their meal.
So that was the evidence about where they had been sitting. If we could now look, please, at document INQ 005153. And page 10 of that document. This is one of the, another, at any rate, of the documents with test results, and I'll ask you a little bit more generally about this in a moment.
Yes.
But just if we, first of all, look, is this a representation of table 27 of the mill?
Yes.
And I think we can all see that there's a key which I'm going to ask you about at the bottom left-hand corner, but we can see that there are some results, the blue and yellow results, those show some contamination. Is that right?
Yes, I believe blue the higher level, and then proceeding down as we go through yellow and grey.
And if we could then just go on to the next page, please. A similar type of plan for ZZs, focusing again on the table where it had been established the scribbles had sat.
Yes.
And more blue and yellow
Yes.
contamination indicators. So 3 points on those, if I may. The first we've already touched on, the fact that contamination was discovered not only at ZZ's but also at the mill.
Yes.
With the chronology as you had established it, provided a, well, obviously a very serious challenge to the idea that they had been poisoned only 2 minutes before they started to show symptoms.
Yes, absolutely. And then, and it absolutely sort of demonstrates the benefit of working backwards from that scene. So from the bench to ZZ's, from ZZ's to the pub, and then continuing to work through what we understood to be Sergei and Yulia's movements.
And we'll come on to look at how that exercise developed in terms of looking at other scenes and
Yes.
so on. The second point, which I've mentioned, just to be clear, these colour-coded plans we should be cautious about, should we not?
We should certainly be cautious about the colour coding on the plans, yes. Part of the reason for that is at the early stages of the investigation we were finding levels, and so colours were being assigned to those levels, but actually as we subsequently went through this we began to find increasing levels, and as a result had needed to add further colours. So at different times those colour codings became quite challenging.
Yes. So is it fair to say that when we're looking at a plan like this,
yes,
we can be reasonably confident when we're simply looking at the, as it were, the internal logic of this plan, because this does show that the blue marks were higher than the yellow marks.
yes,
But if we were to compare it with another, we might, for example, find it had red or purple,
yes, exactly,
completely
right.
different colour,
Yes,
and we would be careful about comparing.
which is less than ideal, I realise, in trying to explain it, but it absolutely was the case that if you take these in isolation, it's very clear that the blue marks here are the highest levels of contamination, the yellows are the slightly lower levels, and that will be the case for every one of these we see.
Just so there's no mystery about it, if we look at the bottom left-hand corner on that scale, of course, it probably doesn't take a genius to work out that after the equal signs are actual numbers.
Yes,
But those have been redacted because they have been made the subject of a restriction order.
that's absolutely correct, yes.
So all of this would be made clear if we could use the numbers,
Yes,
and we will do in closed,
yes,
but in open we can't, which is why we need the health warning about the different colours.
yes, thank you, it's helpful.
Allowing for all of that, we can see, and we've noted, that the readings in ZZ's and the mill seem to have been broadly comparable. There were blue and yellow
Yes,
signs, as well as some where there was no contamination detected. The evidence we heard yesterday from Dame Sally Davis was that the contamination that was found in these two places, she understood to be, the words she used were trace levels or low levels of contamination. Broadly speaking, is that how you understood it?
yes, in comparison to ground zero, which might be the point at which Sergei and Yulia came into contact with sufficient amounts of Novichok to cause their condition, these samples did not appear to represent that.
Yes, so that was the point I was going to come to. So we saw that was what you were looking for. You were trying to understand where this poisoning had happened. And the initial hypothesis was that given the timings, it may well have been ZZ's.
Yes.
We see that the contamination at the mill rather knocked that theory. But
even then the levels were not sufficient.
The levels didn't suggest that either were actually the place where the poisoning had happened.
Correct.
Let's move on then, if we may. Back to your witness statement, to page 18. And I'm still asking you questions about the Thursday, the 8th of March. And if we can look at paragraph 86. In fact, I'm sorry, this is, I think we're now moving on to the 9th of March. Yeah. So the second half of this paragraph, we say that morning, which from context is the 9th of March, Detective Superintendent VN 012, so the SIO,
the SIO.
Received an early morning update that Sergei Skripal's car had returned the highest readings obtained to date, which gave rise about concerns about safety in light of what was known about the car's movements and so on. So is it the case that fairly shortly after the results at the mill and Zizi's, and you're scratching your head about all of that, the results from the car came in and seemed to be important?
Yes, where possible, we were trying to do simultaneous examinations and sampling. But in very challenging circumstances, as you would imagine, yes, in being contaminated with Novichok. So we were working backwards. So we'd sampled the Zizi's and the mill. We now knew that Sergei had driven into town, so we'd sampled his car. And this was then a significant milestone because these results were higher than either of the previous two scenes that we had seen. And so the working hypothesis at this point became that the car was very important to us.
So if we could just look, first of all, if we go to INQ 005677, please. And page 5, we can see a picture of Sergei Skripal's BMW.
Yes.
And if we look at the text on the right-hand side, maybe we could zoom in on the bottom half of the page. We see just above the grid a reference to a series of swabs being taken on the 8th of March, so the Wednesday,
yep,
from the exterior of the vehicle.
Yes.
And then the results are given, and we'll look at another document to see some of the results. And then we will note from underneath the grid that several days later, on the 13th, so the week after,
yes,
a series of swabs were taken from, including the exterior, but also on this occasion the interior. Is
yes,
that right?
Yes.
So nothing from the interior on the 8th, but later that was swabbed.
No, I think important to say, because that seems like a big gap in time. The reality is, each of these scenes was an extraordinarily challenging scene to examine, and in order for us to do that safely and ensure that everybody who entered those scenes safely, it often took us some time just to plan effectively to make sure we were doing it. And clearly, we were working in the context of everything that was happening in other scenes that were being examined as well. So that's the time difference. But yes, we started on the outside and then subsequently made the decision to move to the inside.
Yes, and we'll come. I'm going to show you another document, but just looking, if we look at that grid, just showing the results of the 8th of March exterior swabbing.
Yes.
This is an example. We see a little purple colour.
Yes.
That's a new high-level colour, isn't it?
It is, yes. To demonstrate the point I was suggesting, yes.
Yes. Let's go then, in fact, to that other document. Can we go to 5153, please? Thank you. This is page 5. So I think we can see there. Is it right that this shows us the results of the external swabbing on that first external swabbing?
Yes. So I think I don't know what the 14th of March takes. I think we'd already swabbed it by then. So, but yes, this is exactly. It might be the day it was produced, rather.
Exactly. I think I was momentarily confused by seeing that, but I think they do marry up the other results. I think this does represent that first.
Absolutely.
A relatively few samples on the 8th of March.
Yes. And it shows then that the right-hand side, and we know Sergei was driving the vehicle, had the highest level of contamination on the door handle. There was a still contamination on the passenger side door handle, where we know Yulia was seated in the vehicle, and then some various medium and low levels of contamination on other parts of the outside of the vehicle.
Yes, but notably the highest reading, and we can see from the key in the bottom left, a very high reading on the outside driver's side door handle.
Yes.
And then if we go over the page, please, to page, in fact, it's page 4. I think I'm right in saying that this is a similar diagram showing the internal swabbing.
Yes.
That we looked at in the other document.
Yep.
And again, help us. The purple readings are the highest, followed by the red.
Yes.
What were the highest readings?
So, as you can see from the highest readings, the steering wheel front and rear surface had the highest readings, where they would have been touched. The gear stick and handbrake lever and button, so anywhere you would use when you were ordinarily getting in and driving the vehicle. And obviously the seatbelt buckle at number 7 on there as well was also the very highest. And then we're seeing at number 5 in the red there, the accelerator pedal, the radio controls on the dash, and the inside door release on the passenger side, where Yulia was sitting, had high levels instead of very high levels.
Yeah. So there's a picture developing that the really high levels are associated with the driver.
Yes.
Both in terms of the external door handle and
Yep.
also the internal. Now we'll hear more as we go on about the idea of transferred contamination. Were you able to understand at that stage whether it appeared that contamination inside the car on the driver's side had been transferred to the outside handle, or the other way around, or were you not able to understand?
Well, it appeared the other way around. So the contamination on the driver's door handle was the highest of all of them in terms of levels. I think a really important point to say here is a Wiltshire officer had recovered this vehicle from Sainsbury's car park. And in order to do that, they had moved the vehicle. So they had also had contact with that vehicle. So that might account for some of the cross-contamination inside, but absolutely the highest was the outside driver's door handle.
So aiming off for uncertainty about even more cross-contamination, it looked more likely that it was that the initial...
The first point of contact on the car appears to be that door handle.
The outside.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier you knew Sergei Skripal was driving. How was that?
So I know that now. I didn't know that at the time.
Right. I was going to ask you, at this early stage, obviously you couldn't ask Sergei or Yulia at that point. Did you, in fact, know which of them had been...
I can't remember at what point, but we did have CCTV of them of arriving and parking the vehicle, and clearly different bits of CCTV with Sergei. Okay. And it was clear Sergei was driving in the car park, particularly because Yulia had got out of the vehicle and, as we saw the other day as well, driven in. So
that would have been something, we don't need to know the exact date, but certainly you would have been aware of before you were able to interview them.
Yes, because it was within CCTV.
Now, we were talking about your search for what you describe as the ground zero. These are obviously much higher results than you had found at ZZ's or the mill. Did you have a hypothesis about this possibly being ground zero or not?
So I think so ground zero moved a few times, clearly, given the increasing levels of contamination we were finding as we worked backwards. But yes, at this moment in time, both the detective superintendent from the South East and I felt that the vehicle was the most likely point of being ground zero. Still some concern about the levels being found, whilst we're describing them as very high and the highest we had found so far. That's different to sufficient to have caused the illness that Sergei and Yulia had, so lots of discussions happening about that. But we were, at this point, focused a lot of effort on the vehicle because, of course, it was the highest we had found so far.
Right. Let me move on and ask you just about a few other areas, sites, where testing of this nature was undertaken. First of all, we've heard, of course, about the testing of Yulia and Sergei Skripal's blood. That was what gave rise to the initial information about Novichok in the very early stages.
Yes, I believe it might have been also swabs of their their bodies, their hands and things. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about another thing again, which is swabs taken from their clothes.
Yes.
What were the results there, and what did that tell you?
So I believe contamination, it'd be helpful to see them, but I believe we found contamination on their hands, we found contamination on their clothes, and some of their possessions.
Let me move on to a different site, and that is Salisbury Cemetery.
Yes.
For these purposes, let's go back to your witness statement, please. So 006056, page 18, and paragraph 82. And the last sentence there, so at this stage we're back on the 8th of March, so still in the first week. Can you see, you say you'd received intelligence that led you at that early stage to focus on the graves of Sergei Skripal's wife and son, Ludmilla and Alexander, as potential scenes of contamination.
Yes.
And I think it's right to say that was all to do with some recent tributes that had been found at the grave.
Yes, correct, yes.
Now, at that point, on the 8th of March, well, let me ask you this first. The cemetery in question was a little out of the centre of Salisbury, on the London Road.
It was.
And at that stage, on the 8th of March, what understanding did you have about where Sergei and Yulia might have been, let's say on the 4th of March, beyond Zizi's, the mill, the maltings?
So if you remember in one of my previous evidence sessions, we talked about a witness who thought they had seen Sergei and Yulia's vehicle driving on the Sunday morning. And so there was another factor, that clearly we had a witness who had reported seeing that vehicle at the time. We subsequently found out that was an erroneous report and the vehicle hadn't left at all. But when you take the fact that there were recent items left on the grave and the potential sighting of Sergei and Yulia's vehicle, these were factors that led us to focus some effort on the grave site as well.
And so you say focus some effort, but there was an exercise sampling the soil, the items, and so on.
It took some time. I know we were quite disruptive, unfortunately, to the graveyard more broadly in this process, but yes, it turned out there was no contamination at the gravesite at all.
And if we can go for that purpose to page 19 of your statement, please, paragraph 91. So I think you mentioned the first intelligence bit, perhaps it was the 8th of March. We now see paragraph 91, the 11th of March, so that's the next weekend.
Just the results, yeah.
You say the samples obtained from the graves were reported to be negative. And that, of course, is what you've just said.
Yes.
Just the last point on this, if I may, could we go to a different document, please? INQ 005677. This is the document we've previously been looking at with the car. But for these purposes, if we can please go to page 12. Could we just enlarge the top sort of line of that? We see the picture of the cemetery there. And if we could just focus on the last 2 or 3 lines, please. So this is this is clearly an Operation Wadana report.
Yes, a summary document.
It's a summary document.
Yes.
Let's not worry about exactly when or why it was produced.
Yes.
No doubt there were quite a few documents.
There were many of these, yes.
So the last 3 or 4 lines, it says, the readings obtained from the grave sites are negligible and below a level that DSTL can report on. That doesn't seem to be quite the same as saying that they're negative.
Yeah, that's just an error. It's an equivocal. There was a negative. There was no contamination at the gravesite.
So, but your view that you're telling us now, you're clear, it was negative.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Just while we're in this document, I was going to ask you about 1 or 2 other places. If we could actually zoom in on the bottom line of this schedule, please, of this page. There's a photo. Is this right? This is the ticket machine in the Sainsbury's car park in the Maltings.
Yes, this was almost something I couldn't believe we were discussing at the time when we did the investigation. But clearly, Sergei paid for parking, and this is the parking meter that he paid for parking in the centre. So we were clearly we talked about public safety and our concern for public safety and well-being. Investigatively, this was of no value whatsoever, but for public safety reasons, this was really quite concerning that clearly we know Sturgess to be contaminated, and he had placed a coin in this and taken the ticket from the machine. So this is a picture of the machine and the work that we did on the machine.
And we can see it in the writing on the right-hand side, but was there initially an effort to understand whether the coins that were in the machine might have included the one that Sergei put in there, and an effort to try and prevent anyone being contaminated by
that coin,
either the coin itself or anything that it might have contaminated?
I learnt more than I care to remember about where coins go from parking meters, and we spent a considerable amount of effort trying to locate that particular coin. We were unable to do so, but in any case, the advice was the contamination levels were extremely low and present no risk to public health. So.
But you've already mentioned this, and this is why I asked you about this. As you've said, there's no possibility, presumably, that this could have been the ground zero.
No.
But this was an example of considerable resource being dedicated purely to address a concern about public safety.
Yes, it's a very good example of that, and of course there are others. But yes, where we were working through our investigation and identifying potential areas of contamination, even if they were not of evidential value, we would still nonetheless investigate those things to ensure that the public safety considerations were considered. We would do this clearly in line with the strategic coordination group being run by DCC Mills as well, so that when this wasn't contaminated, it wasn't an issue, we had a process for handing it back to normal use, if you like.
And then just lastly, with this document, could we go back to page 4, please? And first of all, the top half of the page, the bench.
Yes.
What testing was done of the bench, and what were the results?
So the bench was tested. It was tested and found to be negative. As you've heard from other witnesses, obviously, the bench was obviously washed down by the fire brigade as well on the evening of the incident. So not necessarily unusual to have discovered a negative trace there.
Just helps with that. You may not know the answer, but did they wash it down with a sort of sponge and a bucket, or with a hose?
I think they did what the fire and rescue service would often do, and I think it's probably a hose. But I'm afraid I don't actually know the answer.
All right, well, if it's important.
I think it was a considerable amount of water anyway.
Yes. A thorough washing down of the bench.
Yes, that's a good description. Thank you, yes.
But the bench then negative?
Yes.
Let me just ask you about the entry below that. We can see from the document that this appears to have been a small vial, a small bottle that was found at the malting, so presumably within a day or so of very early that week. Is that fair?
Well, so as we were speaking to witnesses that were involved or were aware of the incident, people were coming forward and telling us, and in this case, an individual mentioned that they'd picked up a small bottle appearing to contain liquid and I think placed it into a nearby bin. And so one of the things we wanted to do was recover that bottle as a result.
And you did? And here's a picture of it.
Yes.
Was it a feature of the investigation even in those very early days? And is this something that illustrates that you all had in your mind the possibility that you might not only be discovering areas that were contaminated, like the mill or the car, greater or lesser amount of contamination, but you might actually find a bottle with Novichok in it?
Look, I think from the very start, actually, one of the important things about finding ground zero was, yes, it would give us an evidential start point for our investigation into who might be responsible for this. But clearly, we needed to find if there was any Novichok remaining in Salisbury, and it remained a total focus of the investigation within this process as part of that public safety decision. So the effort then to search this bin within those scenes, because somebody had reported finding a small bottle, whilst we weren't entirely clear what we were looking for in terms of Novichok. Nonetheless, this was an important exhibit to find. It turned out to be not connected and was an entirely negative. But
Thank you very much, Commander. So that is the last question I have about this document. I do have further questions, but I note it's just after 11:15. Is that a convenient moment for a break?
Yes, it is. 11:30, please. Keep your counsel in the meantime.
so
11:30. Yes.
Mr. Murphy, before the break, we were discussing various sites that you and the team identified during that first week of Operation Wadana.
Yes.
And the contamination testing that was undertaken and the results of that testing, as we saw, some of which was aimed towards trying to understand where ground zero was, but not all of it. And we saw with the cash, with the ticket machine,
Yes.
purely public safety there. I want to stay with the first week and come to, or rather come back to 47 Christa Miller Road. We looked at the document which described the very first counter-terrorism police entry into that building, and I think, as we saw, there was no sampling or swabbing that night. But if we perhaps go to your statement, please, so that's INQ 006056 to page 19 and paragraph 88. This is within the part of your statement. We're talking about the 9th of March now. So I think that's the Friday,
yes,
that first week. We can see that you say that it was later on that day, on the Friday, 5:30 in the afternoon, you received confirmation that traces of the nerve agent had been detected at 47 Christa Miller Road. And it's right, isn't it, that in fact there were several, after that initial Wednesday night non-sampling entry, there were several entries during the course of that week.
Yes, there's a point at which, and around this time actually, where we considered the home address to nonetheless be a very significant scene, despite the fact, of course, we were using other scenes to follow and trace Sergei and Yulia. We know that before they left, clearly they had been at home all since Saturday evening, so and so that was important to us all along.
Can I just ask you a sort of process question? You say here that confirmation was received at 5:30 in the afternoon about traces being positive. When we were looking at that schedule, we talked about how quickly samples that were taken would arrive at Porton Down, and you said, well, we wouldn't really delay, so we know it's not far, so presumably within a few hours they would have arrived. I imagine that the answer to my next question will be, it depends. But generally speaking, once the samples have been delivered to Porton Down, how quickly did the results come through?
So I'm not sure that's something I'm able to go into detail in this hearing, actually, in any great detail. But we would have regular conversations with Porton Down about prioritisation, for example. So, and the scientists from Porton Down would help us. So, but it might be, for example, that samples were taken at the end of the day, that they would go to a location to be booked in, but they might stay there for example, for the night or until the next day where they were looked at. So sometimes the samples could come back over after a relatively prolonged period, depending if we had prioritised other samples during that process. So,
all right, well, that's helpful. Thank you. So just sticking with this paragraph, you've explained that as well as it were, following the trail back from the bench via the maltings and so on, you also then took an interest in the house, and we can see here that there was contamination found. Could we have a look, please, at a plan which gives an indication of that? So could we go to IMQ 005153, please, page 1. And can you see there, that's 47 Christa Miller Road, first entry.
yes, when it says first entry, I believe actually technically it's the second entry, but it's the first swabbing entry.
Well, we've seen that on that very first one,
yes,
there were no samples taken, so this would have been the first entry for
yes,
that team. And this is a plan of the ground floor of Christa Miller Road, as we can see from the title.
yes.
And you tell us, but it appears that there are a number of maybe six swabs taken.
Yes.
Numbers 1 to 4 are sort of white, which suggests that they were negative.
Negative, yes.
But those 2 near the front door, red, so high.
Believed to be high, yes.
That's what we can see. Was there any more understanding that you had of it at that point?
No, not particularly. I mean, at this early stage, these were really just initial findings that we were finding in these areas. So, of course, we needed to build up the picture of what had happened in the address so that we could understand whether there was significance to the location of these two samples. So.
Yeah. You may not know, Mr. Murphy, but do you know where number 6 actually is? Is it on the door, on the wall, on the...
I'm afraid I don't know, actually, sir, without reference to the document. I apologise.
That's all right.
Sorry, I believe it's on the... I think it might have been on the inside of the door, actually, but I won't commit to that until we've had a chance to have a review.
Right.
Thank you.
So it's something we may, serried ranks of people behind me may be able to find an answer to. And just going on, Commander Murphy, just for completeness, if we go on to page 3 of this document, please. This would seem to be a sort of similar plan. Again, we can see it says first entry there
Yes.
for the upstairs. And
Yes.
it would appear that there were, in fact, there was no contamination found upstairs on that occasion.
Correct.
So what was found downstairs, close to the front door. It's red, so it's high.
Yes.
We will remember what we said earlier about being cautious about exactly how much weight we can place on all of that. But in practice, when these results came in, so towards the end of that first week, what did that tell you, if anything, about Ground Zero, for example?
Well, actually, I mean, it probably demonstrated that we needed to remain entirely open where Ground Zero was. So if there was contamination in the house, it would nonetheless cause us to review our hypothesis that the car may be the single point of contamination in Ground Zero, because we know that, I mean, again, it would also create another challenge for timing of contamination, but if it was the car, because, of course, we know that when the car left on CCTV, we saw it driving towards the town, that the car then didn't come back to the house at any point. So it meant that we focused again with that team, continuing to review the house as much as possible.
Of course, by this time, let's say the Thursday, Friday of that first week, you would have been very much aware that Nick Bailey and PC Bell
Absolutely.
were in hospital.
Yes. I think PC Bell was out, actually, but yes, but Nick Bailey was certainly in and very unwell.
It was well known that they were both suffering
Yes.
symptoms.
Definitely.
I don't know whether at that point you had reached any firm conclusions about how they had been contaminated, but given what they were both up to on the Sunday evening, you must have had a working hypothesis that that their illnesses might well have stemmed from the search of the Christie Miller Road on that night.
Well, certainly, absolutely one of the hypotheses. DS Bailey had actually been to multiple scenes and the hospital. So there were a number of other issues relating to DS Bailey in terms of where he had been. Not in any way a criticism of DS Bailey, obviously, but he had been to scenes, so that it meant that we, yes, well, of course we were focused on the house at this point, but that didn't exclude us continuing to focus on some other locations.
And that's probably quite a useful hindsight alert. We all know
Yes.
now what happened, and we've heard the evidence about moving the goggles and so on.
Yeah, of course.
So to us, it's very obvious where the contamination happened, but where you were, it was a possibility, but only one of a number of possibilities.
Yes, and we were at this point continuing to focus on, for both investigative and public safety reasons, where was Ground Zero? And also trying to piece together the movements of Sergei and Yulia through CCTV and others to help us inform that Ground Zero point.
And just for completeness then, we've had the health warning about the levels and so on.
Yes.
But I asked you whether the levels in the maltings, in the Zizzi's and the mill were high enough to be Ground Zero, and you
Yes.
said no. I asked you the same question about the car, and you said, well, it was you were working on that basis, although you still had some concerns about how high it was. What about this? Did this perhaps replace the car as Ground Zero or not?
Not at this moment in time. The results we were finding in the house did not dissuade us from still considering the car as Ground Zero. They're not sufficiently high that they would indicate a change in our focus. We were considering both locations, really.
Thank you. Yes. So to answer your question, my prediction that someone sitting behind me would be able to answer your query happily has proved correct.
Well done.
If we could go back to the longer sampling document, please. So that's INQ 006050. And if we could go, please, to page 17 within that document. If we could zoom in on the top half of the document, we can see the first few entries are dated the 8th of March.
Yes.
And it would appear, if we look at at the items, they're all devices.
Yes.
Mobile phone, laptop, mobile phone. Would it appear, Commander Murphy, that those are items that were taken on that very first search that we looked at?
I would expect so.
There was no sampling, but you did explain that the electronic devices that were taken, although they were primarily taken in order to look at their contents, they
Yes.
would also have been tested. So does that appear to be what's going on there?
Yes, although as you see here, they weren't tested. They were simply taken to a location where they could be examined. And actually, if you so they would have been in that very first
Yes.
incident. Yes.
In the very early hours of the
Yes.
8th, because it was the very last hour or so of the 7th and the first hour of the 8th.
Yes.
So that's that. But then we can see there's a series of entries for the 9th. So that would be the first occasion where proper sampling was undertaken. Do you agree?
Yes.
And so if we're then looking at the items on the 9th, about 6 or 7 lines down, there's in the longer column under brief description. Well, in fact, an easier way to do it is if we look right on the right-hand side,
Where the
there
yellow
are only 2 which have a yellow marking indicating there was some positive result, and they are the hallway toilet door handle exterior and the front door handle inside.
Yes.
And
That yellow marking is part of the document, is it, rather than something that's been applied today so that we can see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Good point, sir. The temporary yellow marking has helpfully been removed, so we can see.
Thank you.
And so you'll see, perhaps we should have mentioned this earlier, but if you look at the top of the page,
Yeah.
there is another, we're becoming familiar with this, but
Yes.
within the context of this document, which is as authoritative as it gets,
Yes.
there is a similar but different colour scheme, with grey being very low, then green, then yellow, then orange, then red. And so within the scheme of this document, those 2 positive markings that we saw, which were actually red on that.
Yes. Unhelpfully, they were in different colour on the map, but yes, this does refer to those two tests, which would demonstrate they're actually medium results. Yes.
So, and it indicates that those were the 2 just inside the door itself, and then I think the toilet door.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Let's move on then, if we may. And in your witness statement, Commander Murphy, at page 20 and going over to page 21, there is a section where you indicate a sort of taking stock exercise at the end of the first week of Operation Wadana. So it's paragraph 94. So you indicate that on the 12th of March, that would have been the Monday,
Yes.
so a week after your operation had started, you discussed with Detective Superintendent VN012 a sort of taking stock, where's the operation got to, where are we? Presumably very much part of your role as a critical friend.
Yes. I mean, we actually almost did this every day, but it felt at the end of a week it was an important point to draw together everything that we knew.
And that you've then listed in a series of sub-paragraphs, no doubt,
Yes.
some of the important points, reflections that you had on that occasion. Let's just run our eye down them. You say it remained a highly complicated investigation. It was still fast moving.
Yep.
Public safety of paramount importance. You say that the investigation was key to establishing who was responsible for the attempted murder of the Scripples and the subsequent contamination of D.S. Bailey and others. It was just one arm of a multifaceted response by Her Majesty's government. You needed to follow the evidence. You said that although the statement had been made in the House of Commons by the Prime Minister calling out Russia, you remained open-minded and were not going to allow this to unduly influence the investigative process.
Yes, I mean, look, it's an important development, clearly, and it's important to say that throughout this whole period, of course, we're working very closely with intelligence partners as well. So, but it would be wrong to then singularly focus an investigation of this scale and complexity on one outcome. Clearly, we had a preferred hypothesis, and that was right to say, but it was important that we nonetheless waited until the evidence absolutely confirmed that to be the case and remained open-minded about other possible outcomes.
Yes. Perhaps it's also important to ask you this. I mean, however exceptional the circumstances and the facts of this case, your role was the same as it would be in any criminal investigation, which is to identify whether there is sufficient evidence to send to the CPS to invite them to consider charging someone.
Yes, correct. Absolutely.
And so you necessarily had to focus on, as it were, evidential matters rather than, for example, intelligence or diplomacy or high politics.
Yes, absolutely. It's very different, I think, for, as you say, in diplomatic sense or in a political sense to make a statement, whereas we're basing ours on criminal evidence that we can put in front of the CPS. It's a slightly different threshold for us.
Yeah. Carrying on down, you described the complexity and risk of scene investigations meant that the examination of the scenes had been slower than in other investigations. Was that something that you after this first week, were you feeling that you were noticeably further behind than you would have expected to be in other cases?
Yes, if I had considered this to be a sort of normal counter-terrorist investigation or a murder investigation, because of the complexities of operating in scenes contaminated with Novichok, it was just slower for the reasons of health and safety and ensuring we were protecting the public and our own staff. So whilst I think within the investigation we understood that very well, I think the point of raising it here was it was just as important to make sure that others outside understood those time constraints.
Yeah. Moving on, G, there's the point which you've mentioned about working backwards from the Maltings to try to understand the sequence of events.
Yes.
And then at H, you referred to the fact that at that point scientific testing indicated that the highest levels of contamination were in Sergei Skripal's car. We've seen that.
Yes.
Just holding that thought, if we could look down to paragraph 95, please, immediately below this. You say there, so the 13th of March, so the next day, the final sentence of that paragraph, you say the levels of contamination traced to date did not tend to confirm the identification of a ground zero at that stage. So you were equivocal when I asked you earlier whether the findings of the car suggested you had actually found your ground zero. Is that what's reflected in these parts of the statement?
Yes, I think, again, when we were doing our stop take on the 12th, we recognised it was so really important to do exactly the same thing with the scientists reporting down so that we were ensured that the complexity of the science was considered. And during that process, it was even more clear to us that whilst the highest levels of contamination had been found on the vehicle, they were potentially not so sufficiently high to have caused the illness that we've seen in Sergei and Yulia.
Right. And then just finally on this part, let's just go back and look at I, subparagraph I, and we'll recall that at the beginning of the week you had the steer from PHE, Nick Gent, about the 2-minute
Yes.
posited time between ingestion and symptoms. But it would appear that things have moved on, because what you record here is that scientific interpretation of the effects on D.S. Bailey had resulted in a revised scientific hypothesis that symptoms from contamination could take between 4 to 6 hours to have effect, and that it was most likely that Skripals were contaminated through the skin rather than ingesting it.
Yes, a very significant development compared to before, but obviously entirely consistent with what we were finding in forensically.
Was there the assumption, or the idea that it was most likely that the Skripals had been contaminated through the skin rather than ingesting it? Was that simply because it was apparent that for a period of time before they'd had symptoms, that or rather that the the contamination must have been more than a few minutes before they had symptoms, or was there more to it than that?
Well, I think there were a number of factors, but one of them was clearly that if you ingest Novichok, the understanding was it would take up to 2 minutes to have a significant impact on your health. But we know that they, on the basis of the inquiries to date, don't appear to have had that period, and we found contamination way beyond the 2 minutes. So, and again, entirely based on science and health advice, 4 to 6 hours was entirely consistent with them potentially getting contaminated another way, but certainly not through ingesting it.
Yeah. Let's move on then. That was the Monday, and it was later in that week, was it not, that there were further discoveries which led to your identification of the front door handle as being the ground zero. And I'd like to start by looking in your statement at two apparently important pieces of advice that you received from your scientific advisors at the beginning of the week. First of all, let's look, if we could go back and look at just at paragraph 95, it's the one we were just looking at. Now, this is a meeting you describe having you, DSVN 012, that's the SIO, and Mr. Asman, who will be giving evidence later this week. What was his role?
So he was the head of forensics for the city policing in the southeast, and in this case was the sort of forensics and digital manager for our investigation.
Okay. And you describe having a meeting with MK26. And I think we've probably already had evidence that MK26 was a scientist at Porton Down.
Yes.
And MK26 will, as you know, be giving evidence tomorrow.
Yes.
And so was it in the course of a discussion between those four of you that we can see you discussing the fact that you weren't actually sure that the car was the ground zero and there might well be another place out there?
Yes, exactly that.
And then if we can go on, please, to paragraph 98, which is on the next page. This is on the 16th of March, so slightly later in the week. Let's read this paragraph and then I'll ask you about it. You say, on the 16th of March, DSTL informed us that they believed that traces of Novichok within 47 Christa Miller Road were almost certainly due to inadvertent cross-contamination by the officers who searched the property in the immediate aftermath of the poisonings. Accordingly, forensic teams swabbed and targeted those areas that the police officers had touched. It was agreed with DSTL that on that day work would start on the outside of the front door, and we'll come back to that.
Yes.
I want to ask you first about this advice and this understanding about cross-contamination. Essentially what we're talking about, is this right, is secondary contamination. So,
yes, absolutely, where an officer has touched something that is contaminated and then subsequently passed that on to another item they then touch.
And so the advice you were being given was that the sampling, the results within Christie Miller Road, and we'll come to this in a moment, but by this stage, it wasn't just that first visit, was it? It was others as well.
Yes, we had subsequently been in the premises a lot. It was really about the levels of contamination and also the places sampled that were coming back with results. So I think it was a combination of those things, but that led the scientists from Porton Down to speak to us and explain.
So if the growing theory was that this was transferred secondary contamination, you say that it was from the police officers. Could it also have been, for example, from the Scripples?
Well, absolutely, there's entirely that possibility, yes.
Because I think the conclusion you'd drawn at the mill, for example, and Zizi's was that the Scripples themselves had contaminated those places.
Yes, it remained possible at that point, definitely.
You say here that it was the secondary contamination from the officers. Now, they were one possible source of secondary contamination, but not the only source. Is that fair?
Well, that was because we subsequently know, with the benefit of hindsight, clearly it was just the officers, and the contamination inside hadn't come from Sergei and Yulia. But yes, of course, at the time, we're just focused on the fact that this appears to be cross-contamination rather than the point of contamination.
Yes. But just picking up on a point you made a moment ago, so still focusing on what you understood at the time, one basis upon which you might have favoured the idea that it was at least partly or mainly even to do with the officers was because your understanding about where officers had been
Yes.
and then where the contamination was found. Is that,
Yes.
is that accurate?
Yes.
You also just talked about the levels, and I'd like to show you, if I may go, in fact, if we could go back in INQ to INQ 5153, please. And in the first instance, if we could go to page 2 within that document. This is a page we looked at a moment ago. This was the upstairs chart for the first entry,
Yes.
which, looking at it, suggests that there were several, or 3, I think, samples taken, numbered 7, 8, and 9. None of them were positive. And
Yeah,
we will
so
look at.
we've moved on to the second entry, but yes, the first one
If we
you...
could go to so if we could go to page 3, please. Sorry, I may have said the wrong number. Yeah. So 7, 8, and 9, all negative.
Yes.
And we'll just notice the 9 over there in the single bedroom looks
Yes.
like it might be a bedside table or a
Yes,
wardrobe.
that's exactly what it is, yeah.
Something like that. Then if we can go to the next page, please. So, sorry, it's actually going back a page, it's page 2. So this is the second entry.
Yes.
Just an impressionistic look suggests that on this occasion, officers had gone back to the upstairs, and on this occasion had actually found a fair bit of contamination.
Yes, I mean, I think there's two things. So, particularly where you see number 20, then being that exactly the same bedside table.
Yes.
Clearly, bedside table is quite big. You can swab two or more areas of it and get different results. But yes, it would then be unusual in this circumstance to find no contamination and go back and sample for a second time and find some.
Yes.
And it's entirely indicative of what we subsequently know is that the officers were introducing contamination around the house as they were working.
In particular, as you say, if you did compare those 2 results on the bedside table,
Yes.
your investigative minds would have all thought, hang on a minute, why is there contamination here when it wasn't
right.
there a couple of days ago?
Yes.
And so that, as we now know, of course, is precisely what was happening. And every time police officers went into the house, they were bringing more contamination in.
Yes.
And so, I mean, was it the case that as this possibility became more and more real, that directly led you to think about the front door handle as being one area where this contamination might be being brought in as police officers entered the house?
Yeah, well, so a couple of things happened, really. Important to understand that initial entry by Wiltshire officers, particularly DS Bailey, who was contaminated. So reviewing everything DS Bailey did, reviewing the body-worn video, all of these things allowed us to understand where the officers had been in the house. But of course, yes, then we needed to understand if this was all cross-contamination and there were some concerns about the fact that it may be officers, how on earth were officers going in the house and where was the contamination coming from? And that led to a number of discussions with the scientists reporting down.
Because, of course, although the initial entry by Nick Bailey and others, the idea was you could compare what they had touched and so on, it must follow, mustn't it, that all those subsequent entries by police officers, they all had to touch the front door handle to get in?
Yeah, or at least the first officer in would have done, and then left contamination for others to touch on the way in, so yes.
So if we had seen, we were looking at your witness statement, we don't need to go back to it, but that discussion about cross-contamination took place on the 16th of March.
Yes.
If we could go to back to those emails relating to searches, please. So it's INQ 005668 and go to page 17. And we could have the top half of the page. Thank you. So we see, here's another one of those emails. This is an email sent at the end of that same day, on the 16th, reporting back on the work that had been done that day. And we can see that Team 1, their tasking was to return to the home address to continue with sampling. And the locations where they had been told to sample, first of all, front door handle of house. We'll come back to
Yes.
that. Secondly, let me just ask you about this. The ground below the car door handle, after establishing where and which way it normally parked. So we've seen that that outside driver's side car door handle was the highest point of contamination
Yes.
before you found the front door handle of the house. What was the logic for sampling the ground underneath that door handle?
So if the car was the point of contamination, because clearly we didn't know about the front door here, but if the car, which still had our highest levels anywhere at that moment in time, was the point of contamination, it was really to check whether there was a sufficient amount on the ground underneath where the car had parked to demonstrate that may have been the case. So we were, if you like, seeking to link further contamination to the vehicle if we could by testing the ground underneath.
Right. So if, for example, the ground had come up very high, then that would have supported an idea that someone had
Potentially,
applied
yes.
Novichok to the handle and it had fallen off.
Yes.
That may be the significance of understanding where it was normally parked, because that would be where you would expect to look for that sort of contamination if that is what had happened.
Yes.
But then also we see the other target on that day was the front door handle.
Yes.
And if we can go back then to your witness statement, please. So 006056 at page 22. You describe from paragraph 99 and following, it was the 17th of March. You say you were covering for Detective Superintendent VN012, so what, acting as SIO for the day or for a period of time?
Yeah, so I was a critical friend for the majority of the time, but obviously at this point the investigation had been running for some time, and one of the wellbeing considerations was actually in the leadership of the investigation, because it had been extremely challenging investigation. So we were rotating through that process, and so on this day, as I'd been involved in the investigation from the start, I was covering for the superintendent.
And I won't read this paragraph out, but we can see that you were informed on that day
Yes.
of the results of the test that had happened the day before, which we've just seen. And the significant result was that the front door handle was, as you put it, significantly higher than the samples obtained from the car, which you've explained were at that point the highest that you'd had.
Yes, that's correct. We're not able to talk about the levels here, but the reality is it was significantly higher.
Yeah. And was it, when you've spoken before about a sort of uncertainty about whether, for example, the car was the ground zero, how clear was it to you when you received that that information that you had now found what you had been looking for?
Yeah, almost immediately. Yeah.
We should remember, should we not, and this is something we can explore from a scientific angle more with MK26 tomorrow, but by the time of that testing of the front door handle on the 16th, it had been a week and a half, 10 days,
Yes.
12 days even since the date of the poisoning. Why is that significant?
For a couple of reasons, really. I mean, the weather, first of all, was a significant challenge during this period. We've heard that during this period about the snow and the rain, and the door had been exposed pretty much during the whole of that time. So the result we found, if we'd found it earlier, may have even been substantially higher. I don't think we'll ever actually be able to say that scientifically or know for sure. But and of course, because of that period of time, every police officer that had been going in there and doing some work had been going through that door. Not all would have touched the door handle, clearly, but some would have done. And of course, the house was secured every night, and the scene guards. And so, knowing subsequently that it was on the door from the 17th, caused us to look back over all of the work that we'd done at the house and be sure both our staff and officers, both from Wiltshire doing scene guards, but also our forensic staff were aware of that, and whether there were any health and safety considerations.
Yes. I mean, and just in terms of the sort of reduction in contamination over time, you've mentioned the weather,
Yes.
and obviously the people who've been in and out of the house. We've also heard that this was one of those doors where you, in order to lock or unlock it, you actually have to
Yes.
hold on to the handle and push it up.
Correct.
That must have, I think one of the witnesses described sort of holding firm to the handle. And
Yes.
we can all understand what that means. So it wasn't just a question of people passing and repassing. A whole series of people had actually gripped that handle in the intervening period.
Which I think, given the significance of the Novichok trace on the front door handle on the 17th and the results from the swab on the 16th, still being so sufficiently high that the immediate hypothesis was that this was ground zero, would probably tell you how significant it was likely to have been in the past.
Yes. I want to ask you a related question about door handles. And if I could do this by going... first of all, I'd like to ask you about the letter that we saw, which Sir Mark Sedwill wrote to the NATO Secretary General.
Yes.
So that is, please, INQ 003070. And thank you. So you will recall this letter. I certainly brought it up during my opening. I think it may be that we haven't looked at it since, but just to orientate ourselves, this was as it were, an open letter, was it not, written by
Yes.
Sir Mark Sedwill, who was then the National Security Advisor to the Secretary General of NATO. We'll note the date, it was the 13th of April, so a month or so later
Yes.
than the
door
the
handle
day or
discovery.
so we're now talking about,
Yes.
which was itself a couple of weeks after the poisoning.
Yes.
But the and in summary, Commander Murphy, is this right that this letter sets out some reasoning from the British government behind its assertion that Russia had been responsible for this poisoning?
Yes, as you I think mentioned in your opening, but as we've discussed, there was a much wider diplomatic and political effort ongoing in response to this incident, and this is part of that process.
And if we could then go within this document to the third page, please. One element of the reasoning advanced by Sir Mark Sedwill was about Russian, the British government's understanding of the Russian government chemical warfare programme. And we can read from the top. It says, during the 2000s, Russia commenced a programme to test means of delivering chemical warfare agents and to train personnel from special units in the use of these weapons. This programme subsequently included investigation of ways of delivering nerve agents, including by application to door handles. Within the last decade, Russia has produced and stockpiled small quantities of Novichoks under the same programme. So, noting the chronology, this letter, of course, written after the discovery in Salisbury that the door handle was, as you put it, the ground zero. The query that was raised in the Russian embassy document, which we've also looked at from time to time, if we could go to, please, INQ 004576, page 12, we can see right at the top there, do you see?
Yes.
Well, there's a quote, in fact, a quote from the letter that we've just written about the Russia having commenced a programme to test means of delivering chemical warfare agents and the reference to application to door handles.
Yes.
And then if we drop down two or three paragraphs, there's a sort of series of three tirets. The second one, if the UK had information of Russian experiments with applying chemical weapons to door handles, why did the police not focus on Mr. Skripal's door handle from the very beginning of the investigation?
Reasonable question. But the reality is the investigation did not know that that was the case about the sampling. So it wasn't known to the investigation. We were following the evidence trail as we had it. As I've mentioned, was really important for us to do so. So we got to the door handle through that, following the evidence and conducting investigative and forensic assessment, rather than because of any information provided to us.
Right. So the path to the door, as it were, was exactly as we've set it out.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, we can take that down. I just now The next thing is to ask you just a few questions about certain features of Operation Wadana, which post-dated the discovery of the door handle as being the ground zero. And if we could go back to your statement, please, to page 22, which I think was where we left it. So it's INQ 006056, page 22. And paragraph 101 and also 102, you talk about establishing a clean and dirty line.
Yes.
That's the phrase you use. Not, as I understand it, although no doubt this might exist physically, as it were, in decontamination terms.
Yes.
But this is referring to a timeline and trying to understand when the last time that you can identify was that the door handle was not contaminated. That's the concept of clean and dirty timeline. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes from, so I was for many years a CBRN forensic examiner within counter-terrorism policing. And it's a process understood in CBRN policing that actually is a physical barrier, that is a clean, dirty line in a CBRN incident where you can't cross one or other without appropriate levels of safety equipment and support with you. I adopted the language of it to describe exactly as you've suggested, that now we knew the door handle was contaminated. How could we identify the last point at which it wasn't contaminated and create ourselves a window during which the Novichok must have been applied to it? So that's the process of the clean, dirty line, was for me to understand how could I get to a confirmed clean point, and then we know when Sergei and Yulia left the house, and that window would then be provided as our investigations window.
And of course, at this point, 2 weeks or so after the poisoning, there was no option of talking to Yulia and Sergei about
Correct.
this. We also know that there was no CCTV coverage of the house itself.
Correct.
We've seen, and we will come back next week to look at the various CCTV cameras which, as it were, covered the approaches to Christie Miller Road, Devizes Road,
Yes.
India Avenue,
Yes.
Wilton Road, but nothing which actually could tell you exactly what was going on at that front door.
Yeah, that's right.
So was it witness statements from the Cassidys that had been taken at this point which gave you a sort of major insight into what had happened that weekend?
Yes, so we knew that the Cassidys had obviously taken Sergei to pick Yulia up at the airport on Saturday. They had arrived back around about 1800 hours, and that actually Mrs. Cassidy had gone into the house, I think either to use the bathroom or I think over the discussion over a family member coming to fix the shower or something.
The shower,
Yes. But had gone into the house with Sergei and Yulia. So we knew at 1800 hours, or around about 1800 hours on Saturday, that was the case. And on the basis of what we knew scientifically, if we could show that the Cassidys and their vehicle was not contaminated, and it's reasonable to assume that Sergei and Yulia were not contaminated at that point, because clearly they hadn't fallen ill all night, and they were well when they left the house at 1:30 on Sunday afternoon, that period of 1800 would be significant to us.
Well, and as you say, so significant partly because Sergei and Yulia hadn't appeared to develop symptoms for some considerable time.
Yes.
But even stronger, the Cassidys, and particularly Maureen Cassidy, because she had never developed symptoms at all.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, you also, did you not, tested the vehicle, the
Yes.
pickup truck, which the Cassidys had driven to and fro to Heathrow with Sergei both directions and Yulia coming back.
Yes, correct. Yes,
And-
and with some apologies to Mr. Cassidy, because I think we damaged his vehicle in somewhat in doing that as well. But yes, we did test it, and it was negative.
And he'd driven it away from the Scripples' house
Correct, sir.
on the Saturday evening, had he?
You had, sir.
Well, and we heard evidence that, and I think you were at some pains to identify from Maureen Cassidy where she had sat in the vehicle, with precisely that issue in mind, to try and understand whether at the last stage she might have, had she touched a contaminated door handle, she might then have contaminated the vehicle getting back into it.
Yes, I believe in one of the clarification statements as well, she said she'd closed the door using the handle when she left.
Yes.
So it was really important to us to understand that clean, dirty line, and of course it turned out that the catalyst in their vehicle was not contaminated.
Yes, and just to make that point, if we could go to INQ 005677, please, and go to page 13. We see the top there, there's Mr. Caster's vehicle. Doesn't look too damaged in this picture, but who knows. I mean, just in passing then, it appears to have been seized and taken.
Yes, so
somewhere
yeah,
for
we
a
recovered
formal
it, yes, and then did a detailed examination of the vehicle to see if they could find Novichok.
And did that was that examination sort of driven by your understanding of who had sat where and
Yes,
so on?
yes,
So it was a thorough investigation.
definitely,
But the results, as we can see, was that there was no trace of contaminant.
absolutely.
And so with all those factors in mind, not just the fact that the Scripples hadn't fallen ill overnight, but perhaps more importantly, Maureen Cassidy not being symptomatic and also the
Yes.
vehicle, did that give you quite a high level of confidence about the handle having been uncontaminated at 6 o'clock or thereabouts on the Saturday evening?
Yes, so that became a very significant part of our prioritisation process at that point. So from 1800 hours on the Saturday night until when Sergei and Yulia were known to have left the house, or at least seen on CCTV just after past, driving their vehicle into town, that window was the point at which Novichok must have been applied to that front door.
Yeah. And of course, we will come back to look further at those aspects when we hear about Operation Katerva and your investigation into
Yes.
Messrs. Petrov and Bosharov. Just moving on to a separate topic, which is the question of what we would call in shorthand the search for the bottle, or a bottle. I think you mentioned earlier this morning that one of the reasons right from the start that you wanted to understand where ground zero was because it might help you understand whether there was a discarded container or where to look for it.
Yes, I mean, I should just say at this point we had no idea it was a bottle, clearly, and we do now. But yes, and we needed to identify what the Novichok might have been in both consistency and type, but what it might have been contained in. And ground zero was an important point for us to be able to identify whether or not we needed to make some extra effort to try and find any outstanding Novichok.
Yes. And so once you had established ground zero, did that then
Yes.
sort of provide further sort of impetus, but
Yes.
understanding that governed the search for any container that
Yes,
might be
yes,
there
absolutely.
to be found?
Yes.
And just to, I'd like to take you to 2 or 3 paragraphs in the police report, just so that we understand the state of affairs at that point. So it's IMQ 005820, page 34. Just reading from paragraph 104. You make the point about the front door handle, and then you say at that stage there were no indications as to what the Novichok looked like, how it had been packaged, or how it had been applied to the door. There was no evidence to suggest that the Novichok had been or may have been discarded. Nonetheless, investigators were mindful of this possibility and sought advice from a National Police search advisor. So does that give us some context to this question?
Yeah, so now we had confirmation of a location and a time period. It was now important for us to take some advice about what the extent of any searching might be and the circumstances between a potentially discarded container.
Now, you refer to search advisors here, and we'll see in a minute what their advice was. Of course, I've already mentioned that Mr. Asman is giving evidence later this week, and
Yes.
this will be a matter upon which he will focus.
Yes.
But just to be clear, Mr. Asman was a counter-terrorism police officer. With these National Police advisors, they were not. That's not Mr. Asman. They were a separate.
Yes, actually, I think one of them was a Wiltshire search advisor, and then we sought some support from a national search advisor, and they came together to help us strategise that search process.
In other words, advice from outside the existing group
Yes.
who were investigating.
Yes.
But if we, as I say, I won't go into this in too much detail because we'll be coming back to it with Mr. Asman, but just to complete this sort of update, if we look at paragraph 106, you say the search advisor was involved, in fact, from the very beginning, from the 4th of March, but following the identification of the front door as the most likely original point of contamination, 3 hypotheses were provided as to where the suspects may have discarded the Novichok, if they had done so at all, and those were in the immediate vicinity of the attack site.
Yes.
At a point where they had become out of line of sight of the house, so nearby but not right outside. And then the third was at the point where they could have changed their mode of transport, such as the cross-section between footpaths and roads.
Correct.
And you then add that the search for the poison used in the attack was led by the CTP Head of Forensics and Digital Investigations, VN513, the Forensic Manager, and the CBRN Tactical Advisor. And that's the Forensic Management Team taken together.
Yes. So these are highly trained police officers that are trained in area search, for example. We call them pulsers, but nonetheless, that's after police search advisor, the person that plans the search. And they were working alongside our forensic staff to then conduct that search within the parameters decided.
With that in mind, I'd like to just go back to your statement, please, INQ 006056. First of all, to page 23. At paragraph 107, at the bottom of this page, Commander Murphy, you really just summarise what we've just looked at. You refer to those paragraphs of the report. You say you know how the Novichok would have been transported or applied to the door.
Yes.
No evidence suggested it had been discarded, but you were mindful of that possibility, and you refer to searching strategies and the involvement of the pulsars and so on. Then if we can go over the page to paragraph 109, you talk about a search strategy meeting. Again, this is something we will pursue with Mr. Asman.
Yes.
And the various hypotheses. But just, do you see the line about 10 lines down, which starts DSUVN 012?
Yes.
This is where you say, I believed it was less likely that the item was disposed of close to the scene because it could then be traced to the perpetrators. Can you expand on that, or is there simply no more?
Well, I mean, less likely, but not entirely unlikely, is that, of course, if an item were to be discarded very close to the house and subsequently found, it could potentially be linked to the suspects and their presence at that location. So we had this formed part of our conversation with the Pulsar and the search advisors, and it was decided to widen the search beyond the immediate vicinity of the home address into the pathways and, as you described earlier, the pathways and the points at which intersections in paths and roads.
Yes. And one of the points you make in your statement is that this was, again, a complicated decision to make, because by this stage, it was a couple of weeks or so after the attack, and so
Yes.
it involved cordoning off areas in that domestic area near Christie Miller Road that had not been cordoned off in the week or two since the attack.
Yes, and taking a step back and imagining how the public of Christie Miller Road and the surrounding roads would feel about that. Apart from the cordon around the home address, they had been allowed. There's a children's play area in this area, by the way, as well. So they'd been allowed to use that. It wasn't, it was in complete use, and then suddenly we were, on the basis of our strategy, cordoning those areas. And so we had to manage the necessity to search, as we felt it was appropriate to do so, for public safety and evidence reasons, balanced with the sort of trust and confidence of the residents of the area. And we had to do that very closely with Wiltshire Police and the SCG and Gold. And Mr. Mills rightly raised some concerns about what this would mean to the public. So I led some communications with the public and the house-to-house inquiries that informed this search area so that we could communicate clearly to the people in the area what we were doing.
Yeah. Last question about this, if I may, and it involves going to a different document. In fact, if we can go to MK26's witness statement, so INQ 005923, it's page 18, paragraph 37. Now, as I've said, we will be hearing from MK26 tomorrow, but I just wanted to ask you about this part of the witness statement, if I may. It says, consideration was given during Operation Wadana in discussion with CTP to the type of vessel that may have contained the Novichok. As described in paragraph 23 above, given my knowledge of nerve agents, it seemed likely that the container could be small, possibly able to contain a very small quantity of material, and likely to be made of glass or PTFE, as other plastics could have compatibility issues with chemicals resulting in leakage. While the risk of breakage with a glass container is greater, it would perhaps have been easier to disguise as an everyday product. And then the witness goes on and talks about transportation. It appears from MK26's statement that some discussions had been had with CTP about the type of container that might be expected. Is that something that you were either aware of or involved in?
Yes, had lots of conversations really though. I think it, over a period of time, lots of discussions and different hypotheses for what the Novichok may have looked like and what it was contained within and how it might have been applied. We had lots of discussions about that over time. I mean, I should say, when you're running a search like this one, whilst of course this kind of information is useful to a search team, the search team are going to flag anything they find. So, and as you'll hear from Mr. Asman, they found lots of things not relevant to the investigation, but they will of course find everything. So, it would be entirely consistent that they would have been looking for these things as part of that process.
Yes. Yes. Well, that's something, as you say, we can explore further with Mr. Asman. The last issue I wanted to address, as far as the investigation is concerned, is just about the interviewing of Julia Skripal. It has been something I've referred to more than once, that in this early period, you could not ask the Skripals where they'd been, what had happened, who had done what they'd touched, and so on. And so you had to conduct your investigation without that information.
Yes.
But it's right, isn't it, that as time passed, it did become possible to interview first Julia Skripal,
yes,
and later Sergei Skripal.
Yes.
And of course, amongst the questions you asked them were what they've been doing on that Sunday. And this is something you refer to, if we could go to page 25 of your statement, paragraph 113. And again, I won't read this, but you refer here, do you not, to the fact that in one of the interviews with Julia, when she was the first to become conscious and able to be interviewed, wasn't she?
Yes, she was.
She did in fact provide some detail which explained how it was that they had both become contaminated from the door handle.
Yes, absolutely. So even after finding the door handle, it remained a question, how did they both become contaminated? Now, it may be that one wasn't cross-contaminated the other, but of course, when we were able to speak to Julia, we were able to then discover the details.
Well, I'll interrupt you there because I was going just to take you to those few pages of the transcript. Yes. So if we could go, please, to INQ 005761. Thank you. We've gone to page 15 now. I don't think we need to bother go back to the first page, but we will note, I'm sure you'll agree, Commander Murphy, this was an interview that took place on the 16th of April.
Yes.
And just picking it up about halfway, a little below halfway down, we can see that Julia says, I was getting dressed, making my hair dried, make sure that when he got out of the shower, that was Sergei was having a shower, he had enough time while I was preparing everything, he had enough time to get dressed, go downstairs, sit in the car and wait for me.
Yes.
And police officer said, okay, so he sat waiting for you. And she said, yes, outside of the car. And then there's a discussion about why they didn't walk to town but drove because they wanted to go shopping. The time that they left the house, not quite right, but close enough. And then again, Julia's asked, how long had your dad been sat in the car waiting? She said maybe 5 minutes. It wasn't long.
Yes.
There's some detailed questioning about how she'd left. And you see further down that page, she explains that she'd had the key. And then if we could just go over the page, please, to page 17. About halfway down, a little lower than that, we see Julia saying, yes, just there. She says, so when I went out, I just had to close the door and turn the key because it was already in the lock. VN0838 says, okay.
Yeah.
It says, that's Sergei, put it in there for me. And she's asked, but you explained earlier about the handle, you had to put the handle up. And she agreed, the handle up and the lock and get the keys. And she then explains that she gave the keys to her father. So did it appear that Sergei had left the house first, no doubt using the front door handle, and had put the keys into the front door?
Yes, I believe shut the door and put the keys in.
Yep.
So that would have led to him being contaminated. He went to the vehicle, and then subsequently Julia left a few minutes later, and then was able to shut that door again and lift the handle to lock it, so leading to both of them then getting fully contaminated from the door handle.
So it explained then that they had both suffered primary contamination because the narrative was they'd both, on leaving, touched the door slightly different times.
And then everything that followed in the pub, in ZZ's, in the car, was contamination, secondary contamination from Sergei and Julia.
Yeah. One final area of questioning, Mr. Murphy, and it relates not directly to the investigation, but to safety precautions during the investigation. And you will, I know that you've been following the evidence in the inquiry, so you will be aware that one of the issues that we have looked at is the question of whether police officers were trained in recognising the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning.
Yes.
And also distinguishing those signs and symptoms from the signs of opiate poisoning between Salisbury and Amesbury, so after the 4th of March 2018, and you will have heard the evidence about that relating to Wiltshire Police, including Mr. Mills accepting, broadly speaking, that that wasn't done, and that with hindsight at least it should have been. But I want to address the same issue with you with regard to the counter-terrorism police in Wiltshire. First of all, very roughly speaking, can you give us an idea of how many counter-terrorism police officers were brought into Salisbury and the surrounding areas to assist with Operation Wadana?
Several hundred at least, and at various times up to 250 officers were deployed into the Salisbury area.
So we've obviously only heard about maybe a handful of those people, the people leading the investigation, but it was a sizable number.
Very sizable,
of counter-terrorism police officers, nothing to do with Wiltshire Police, brought in to help conduct all the various different investigations we've heard about.
Correct.
And will you agree that the chances of those counter-terrorism police officers being on the front line of some sort of subsequent contamination incident is very similar to the chances of Wiltshire police officers being involved in that sort of incident?
To a point, yeah. But most of them were investigators. So obviously a good number were specialist investigators with deep knowledge in CBRN and were in one place. But many of them were investigators. So right to call them frontline, but not first responders.
Exactly.
So yes, very different.
So they wouldn't have been responding to 999 calls.
No.
So for obvious example, in Amesbury,
No.
They weren't responding to 999 calls.
Correct.
Accompanying ambulances out to incidents.
Yes.
But they were working, because of the investigation, in the very places where nerve agent poisoning might be found.
Yes.
So it's certainly foreseeable that they could have been there at a time when either another police officer or a member of the public was contaminated.
Yes.
Were those counter-terrorism police officers provided with training in identifying the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning?
So many were, but not all, no.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so many either had knowledge or were deployed as a result of their requirement to work in a CBRN environment or with our CBRN partners, for example. So they, of course, had a lot of information available to them at the time. But if they were normal detectives conducting outside inquiries, outside of the standard information given to all police officers at the time around what we call the initial operational response, the IOR guidance, they wouldn't have been given anything specific, no.
Yes. So we've heard something about the special CBRN training, and we've seen that that, as you say,
Yes.
those officers indeed did have that sort of training. In fact,
Yes.
we'll hear from one such officer later on today. And I think it's the part of the point you're making is that there was a reasonable proportion of the CTP officers that went to Salisbury precisely because of the nature of the incident did have that training.
Yes,
But
not all.
The others were in the same position as the Wiltshire police officers. They'd had their basic training, but nothing further.
Yes, in essence, they should all have been familiar with the IOR, which provided guidance to how you would assess and respond to anything that you felt might have been a CBRN incident. Now, clearly, the difference, I suppose, between CTP officers and Wiltshire officers was those CTP officers had access to a dedicated CBRN forensic team that were constantly available throughout the whole time they were there. So lots of information and advice readily available throughout that time. And as part of the CT network, obviously access to the CBRN centre more generally.
Access to expert advice.
Yes.
But still, let me ask you, put the same point to you that we put to the Wiltshire police. Yes. In hindsight, would it have been sensible for you to have undertaken an exercise in educating not just your CBRN experts, but all officers being deployed to Salisbury, to an area that was known to have this risk, so that everyone would have had a level of understanding of what the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning were?
I mean, at the time, I suppose the truth of it is, yes, absolutely. We could have given all officers more information on signs and symptoms. Even now, as I sit here, it's not something we would routinely do to investigators conducting outside inquiries. We wouldn't ordinarily do that even now. But the IOR is different now, so it contains additional information that wasn't available at the time. As a result of learning from Salisbury, all officers now have much more information available to them than they would have done at the time.
Right. So that's a development.
But it's a recent development. That, by the way, it's not something between Salisbury and Aylesbury. It's a 2023 development.
Yeah. And then I just want to move on to a related point, which is not so much about CTP training of its own officers in Salisbury in 2018, but the function that CTP exercised in disseminating learning to Wiltshire at the time. And if we could have, please, on screen INQ 006162. Now, Murphy, this is a document. Not sure if I don't think we have looked at this document before, although we have looked at documents that are referred to in it. And this is an email from CTP dated the 13th of March to various recipients, including within Wiltshire Police.
Yes.
And what I suggest is that this was a covering email, which we can see attached at least two documents, or at least described at least two documents. One was a CBRN specific document about the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning. That's the document which is referred to in the early part of the email in the grey area. And you can see, can you see in that immediately underneath the paragraph with the red writing, the underlined section, only for CBRN community. Now that is, I'll show it to you in a minute, but that is a document we've seen.
Yes.
And then further down, I think it's probably the last bullet point there, you can see, please attach for your information, advice to all frontline officers, which is included in the advisory message, hazardous substance exposure first responders. And you may remember the evidence that Mr. Mills gave.
Yes.
That that is, if Wiltshire Police received a slide pack, which they subsequently disseminated using their own internal emailing and so on. That, I think, is the document that was referred to in the final bullet point.
That would make sense.
I don't know if you recall it, but do you recall that one of the points that could be made is that although what was emphasised was how to react to a hazardous episode,
Yes.
it did not contain guidance as to exactly what the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning were.
Yes. I think it's probably fair to say that slide deck was entirely consistent with the information that was available to all frontline officers at the time, which is how to recognise what a hazardous substance incident might be and how to respond to it and seek specialist support.
Yes, but you will agree, I don't want to go to it unless we have to, it didn't have those signs and symptoms in it.
I believe that's the case. Yes, it didn't. Yeah.
In contrast, and if we perhaps let's go to this document, so it's INQ 006069, the first of the documents, the one that's restricted to CBRN, we have seen this on more than one occasion.
Yes.
Mr. Darch from the ambulance service mentioned getting it. There we do see a sort of ready reckoner of signs and symptoms, but as we've seen, we saw it in the email, we can see here, it's got quite express handling instructions.
Yes.
That it shouldn't be circulated any more broadly. So I'm putting this point to you as a sort of corporate CTP witness. The criticism, potential criticism, is that in the immediate aftermath of the Salisbury poisoning, CTP had first idea, which is we need to tell people all about the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning. We need to, including, as we've seen, to Wiltshire Police.
Yes.
But in doing so, they required Wiltshire Police not to pass this very detailed information, and it might be thought useful information, onto their frontline officers, but at the same time gave a much more generic, non-specific document that should be passed on to them. Can you see, at least with hindsight, that was not the most useful way that this exercise could have been conducted?
Yes, this document should have been made available to all frontline officers. I mean, it wasn't not to. It was to seek authority to do so if you wish to do so. But that restriction is entirely unnecessary for this document. Yes, absolutely, it should have gone to.
And so one can hope.
Should have been made available to everybody.
I mean, we saw, for example, we heard in the evidence yesterday that one of the first things that VN 005 did on the night of Sunday, the 4th of March, is to give DI Mant his ready reckoner, which was very similar to this. Say, look, this is what. It's not sensitive, is it? And it's important that people on the scene understand those signs and symptoms.
But that's a very good example, though, of why I suspect the restriction was placed on this document at the time. It's very rare that we provide this level of detail to every frontline officer, because every frontline officer, in the IOR sense, would need to have in their mind a high-level understanding of it, not necessarily the detailed understanding that you see here, in order for them to focus and respond. The more information, and this is the risk, by the way, that very, very busy frontline officers, the more information we give them, the more they might see CBRN incidents where there aren't CBRN incidents. That might affect our response. So at the time, it was uncommon for us to put this amount of information in the hands of all frontline officers. But as you say, in hindsight, and in fact, the 2023 version of the IOR has this information available to it for all frontline officers to say. In my view, that restriction was unnecessary.
And as you helpfully indicate, that is something that practice has already changed.
Yes.
So that's, in fact, the end of my questions for this witness.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Mr. Straw.
Questions, sir. Then I would
Can you
expect
do
it to be
it
about
conveniently between now and 1 o'clock?
hopefully.
Then do.
Thank you.
So I think we would have been normally due to pause for lunch at this time. I wonder whether, if Mr. Straw's going to be 15 minutes, we might take a break.
You all right? Let's try and get to 1 o'clock. Yes, if we can take the witness all in one go, it's easier for everybody. But if you feel the need to ask for time, Mr. Straw, just ask.
Thank you very much, sir. Commander Murphy, I'd like to ask you first about a conclusion that you explained to Mr. O'Connor earlier, which is that the Novichok must have been applied to the front door handle after around about 6 p.m. on Saturday night.
Yes.
So in other words, it wasn't on the front door handle at the time that Mrs. Cassidy and Sergei Skripal touched that.
Yes.
At around 6 p.m. on Saturday night.
That's correct.
Now, you've already been through some of your reasons with Mr O'Connor, but because it's potentially important, I'd like to go into a bit more detail, if I may.
Yes.
Firstly, to look, please, at negative readings on items that Mr Skripal touched after he touched the door handle that night. So could we first please look at the document that's been up already a couple of times? It's 6050. And page 17 of that document, please. Commander Murphy, do you see on the left-hand column there's LSN, a number, and all of them have PTN/18 at the start, and then there's a distinct number for each of them.
Yes.
And about 6 down, there's one that's 0081. Do you see
Yes.
that? And do you see, as we trace across on 0081, that's a diabetes monitor on the desk in
Yes.
scene 5.
Yes.
And then at the end there, it shows, is this right, that no Novichok was on that diabetes monitor?
Yes, correct.
Thank you. I'm going to come back in a moment to the plans of the house that we saw, just to see where exactly they were in the house. But if we can first go through the plan. Is it right, below that, 0082, mobile on dining table, also negative?
Yes, I wasn't aware that actually the digital devices were tested, but yes. That would appear to say negative, yes.
Thank you. And then 2 below that, so 0084, TV remote on lounge table, also negative.
Yes, correct.
About halfway down the page, 0136, do you see that?
Yes.
Scene 5, tap lever,
Yes.
and the row below that, toilet flush handle,
Yes.
and then below that, 0138, inside door handle,
Yes.
all 3 negative.
Yes.
And again, so we're going to come back in a moment to see exactly where these items were.
Well, it's fairly clear, but yes.
Okay.
No, whatever you need to do.
Okay. And finally on this page, do you see further down, 0147,
Yes.
it has top handle of cabin holdall,
Yes.
also negative.
Correct.
Thank you. And to just complete the exercise on this document, please, could you turn to page 23, document. Towards the bottom of the page, there's 0749. Can you see that?
Yes.
Scene 5, area 9, light pull knob in bathroom.
Yes.
Do you see that? Is it your understanding that refers to the upstairs bathroom?
I believe so. Area 9 would have been upstairs, yes.
Okay. And also negative?
Yes.
And then near the bottom of the page, 0761,
Yes.
you see room 2, flush handle on toilet cistern.
So that would have been downstairs toilet, I'd imagine, at that low number.
Thank you. And also negative.
Yes.
Thank you. Could we turn up a different document, please? 5153. We've been to this already today. Could you go to page 1 of that document, please? So again, the downstairs of 47 Christie Miller Road.
Yes.
Do you see a room there with apparently a toilet in it with a number 2 in it?
Yes.
Just to the right of the front door?
That's the one we were just discussing, yes.
Yeah. Is that where the negative finding on the toilet flush was
Yes.
found? And then to the right of that, the room with a 6 in it,
Yes.
do you see there 0081 is
Yes.
marked? That was the diabetes monitor on the desk that we just saw.
I
where there
believe
was
so, yes.
A negative finding. And so on the 28th of October, we heard evidence read out from Mr. Skripal. Commander Murphy, were you in court when the evidence was read out from Mr. Skripal?
I wasn't, no.
Do you recall from his evidence that Mr. Skripal said that he took his diabetic medicine on the evening or night?
I have read that in that transcript, yes.
And is it your understanding that the diabetes monitor would have been used in that process?
Yeah, I believe also there's a report that suggests that there was a tissue with a piece of blood next to the monitor suggesting recent use. So, yes.
Ah, okay. Very helpful. And similarly, do you recall Mr. Skripal said he used the downstairs toilet on the evening and the night of the...
I believe that's the case, yes.
Okay. Tracing then anti-clockwise around the house, the room with a 5 in it. Do you see that?
Yes.
There's a item there, PTN/180082. That was the mobile phone on the dining room table.
Yes.
And it's right, isn't it, that you had evidence that Mr. Skripal used that phone on the day that he went to Heathrow, on the 3rd of March?
Yes, I believe that's the case, yes.
Carrying on then, please, to the lounge, which is to the left of the plan, room 3.
Yes.
Do you see top left, there's PTN 180084,
Yes.
which we saw was the TV remote
yes.
on the table.
Yeah.
And again, do you recall Sergei's evidence was that he switched on the television using the remote control on Saturday evening?
Yes, correct.
Over the page, please, to page 2. This is the upstairs of Christie Miller Road. And could we start, please, at room 9, so the bottom of the plan?
Yes, the bathroom.
Bathroom, thank you. And there are marked numbers 0138, 0136, 0137, which we heard were the negative findings in the bathroom, on the toilet, the sink and the door.
Yes.
And we also heard, it's not marked, but there was a negative finding on the light switch. That was 0749
Yes.
in that room. And do you recall Mr. Skripal's evidence that he used the bathroom on Saturday night, for example, for a shower, and to use the toilet on 2 occasions?
Yes, I think also on Sunday morning, yes.
Yeah.
Going clockwise this time, please. Room 10. Do you see 13, the circle with the 13 in it?
Yes.
There. So that's 0139, which we heard was a negative finding on the bedside light.
Yes, and that's Sergei's room, I believe, that one.
Sergei's room, thank you. And do you recall evidence that he used his bedside light that night?
I don't, but...
Okay.
Yeah.
The last one, please, is in room 12, so it's top right of the plan. Do you recall which room 12 was?
Actually, I think that's Yulia's room.
Yulia's, thank you. And the circle with 21 in it has number 0147.
Yes.
And we heard that was a negative finding on a cabin holdall.
Yes. Actually, I think the others were inside and outside of the cabin hold all were negative.
Right. Do you recall the evidence from Mr. Skripal and Mrs. Cassidy that Mr. Skripal took up Yulia's cabin holdall bag and put it in her room that night?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Moving on then to Mrs. Cassidy, you've already covered the Isuzu and the negative findings in the Isuzu. We heard evidence from Mr. Cassidy that Mrs. Cassidy would have touched the seatbelt and the door handles,
yes,
getting into the passenger side. The thorough searches you described of the Isuzu, did they include that area?
I don't recall the specific sampling areas, but we did focus upon both actually Ross Cassidy and Mrs. Cassidy and their place in the vehicle. And that included things like we had tested seatbelts, door handles, things like that.
Yeah. And all negative?
Yes.
And just a point of detail, were the samples taken from the Isuzu on the 20th and 21st of March 2018?
I believe so, yes. I'm not sure of the date, sorry.
Not sure. If need be, sir, the reference is 5668, page 23.
28th of March, did you say?
20th and 21st.
Thank you.
And going back to your ultimate conclusion, that the Novichok wasn't on the door handle at
Yes.
6 p.m. when it touched. Did that evidence, that sort of evidence, support that ultimate conclusion that you?
Yes, absolutely. So lots of the things that we looked at, it's probably easier to say, nothing pointed away from the conclusion that 6 o'clock was our clean line in respects of the door handle.
Thank you. The last issue is about what the Skripals touched after they left at 1:30 p.m. or thereabouts on the 4th of March. Now, again, you've already gone into this with Mr. O'Connor, so I just want to pick up on a couple of details, if
Yes.
I may. Could we have on screen, please, 5153? Page 6. This is the BMW, so the Skripal BMW, which we've already looked at 2 pages of Novichok findings of. For completeness, this is just the 3rd page of Novichok findings. Could you confirm, please, that, well, do you see number 16 there?
Yes?
Finding 16. Can you remember where that was?
I think 16 is the passenger side seatbelt, but I'd need to check for sure from the list, but I'm sure that's what it was.
Yeah.
And are there very high readings on that?
Yes.
Thank you. And hopefully the last document I need to refer you to, 5145, please. More Novichok findings. You see the right-hand column there contains a number of findings which are listed as medium to high.
Yes.
And does that show high levels on the car key?
Yep.
Patient 1, is that Sergei Skripal?
I believe so.
His right hand, his left hand. Is that right?
Yes.
And then a bit further, medium levels on the house key.
Yes.
And then medium levels on patient 2. Is that Yulia?
I think that's
Skripal?
Julius. Yes.
So her right hand and her left hand.
Yes.
And finally, is it right? High levels in Sergei's pocket.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes.
So going back to their accounts, we heard Sergei saying he got into the car, put on the seatbelt, turned the car around. Are the findings that we've seen on the car and so on, they correspond to the items that he touched after leaving the house at that point?
Yes.
And similarly with Yulia, she left the house, she got into the passenger seat side, put her seatbelt on, gave the key to her father. Again, the medium to high levels correspond to what she said she did.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reporting from both of them in their accounts is entirely borne out by the forensic testing and the results.
We looked at table 27 at the mill and also table 37 at ZZ's.
Yes.
Is it right that the Novichok findings on both of those were low to medium?
Yes, although I would just caution about the levels for the reasons we've talked about quite a bit. But yes, it's fair to say that they were secondary contamination rather than primary contamination.
Looking at the picture overall, is it right to say that the items that the Skripals touched, the longer it was after they touched the door handle, then broadly the levels of Novichok were lower on those items?
In the broadest sense, that's probably true, yes, but clearly there are some, and it's hard because of the levels, and we're not able to talk about the actual sample results. But yes, that's broadly the case.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Straw, for your help. Is that all for Mr. Murphy, at least for the time being?
For the moment, it is, yes.
Okay.
So,
Well, there you are. You know where you are, Mr. Murphy, and
thank you.
you no doubt know when you're coming back.
So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Shall we say 2:10?